He had ordered empires buried. He had signed death sentences without batting an eye. He had looked his enemies straight in the eye during their final moments without blinking. Yet it was just one pair of eyes, silver blue, like moonlight reflected on a night lake, that left Dominic Vescari speechless in a small roadside cafe in the mountains. Those eyes were his. And the person who possessed them wasn't him. It was a girl. Perhaps 12. Perhaps 13. And her mother had just emerged from the kitchen, the very woman Dominic had believed betrayed him for 12 years. Click like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. And stay until the end, because this is only the beginning. The mountain road had no name on any map Dominic trusted. His driver, Cale, had pulled off the main route 40 minutes earlier after a rockslide blocked the highway pass. Standard protocol when traveling through territory the Vescari organization didn't control was to avoid population centers, avoid gas stations with cameras, avoid anything that could place a man like Dominic Vescari in a specific location at a specific time. Cale knew this. The two men riding in the back seat with concealed weapons knew this. Everyone in the convoy knew this. But the secondary road had taken a turn nobody planned for, and the black SUV's fuel gauge had dipped into the red, and now they were coasting down a gravel shoulder toward the only building visible for miles in any direction. The cafe had no sign. Or rather, it had the ghost of a sign. Wooden letters above the door, most of them bleached and warped by years of mountain winters, until only the curves remained, suggesting a name that had long since stopped mattering. The parking area was packed dirt. Two old pickup trucks sat near the door. A rusted bicycle leaned against the wall. A hand-painted chalkboard propped in the window read, "Open. Hot coffee. Real food." Dominic looked at it for a moment through the tinted glass. He was 51 years old. He had not eaten since 5 that morning. He had been in the car for 9 hours across 3 different vehicles, crossing from one province to the next on business that had no paper trail and required his personal presence in a way that irritated him deeply because personal presence meant personal risk. His back hurt. His left knee had been aching since last winter. There was a tension behind his eyes that had lived there so long it had stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like part of his skull. "Fuel, Saeed," Cale said. Not a question, a statement of fact. "I know. There's nothing else for another 30 kilometers. Dominic already had the door open. He stepped out into mountain air that hit him like cold water, clean and sharp and completely indifferent to who he was. He stood still for a second on the gravel, hands at his sides, scanning the tree line out of habit. The road behind them was empty. The road ahead curved out of sight into pine shadows. Nothing moved except the wind. He walked toward the cafe. The inside was small. 6 tables, maybe 7. Mismatched chairs, a long counter with 4 stools, the kind of laminate surface that had been wiped clean 10,000 times and still looked slightly sticky. A coffee machine that had to be 15 years old rumbled on a shelf behind the counter. The walls had photographs pinned to them. Mountain landscapes, faded and curling at the corners, some of them black and white. A ceiling fan rotated slowly, even though the air didn't need it. 2 men in work clothes sat at a corner table eating soup. An older woman near the window had a newspaper folded open. Nobody looked up when Dominic entered. His men came in behind him and spread out quietly the way they always did. One near the door, one finding a sightline to the back of the room. Neither sat down. Neither drew attention. They had been doing this long enough that it looked like nothing. Dominic took a stool at the counter. He had his jacket on, plain charcoal gray. Nothing that announced money, nothing that announced power. His watch was covered by his sleeve. His phone was in his inside pocket. He looked from a distance like any other tired man stopping for coffee on a long drive through the mountains. He had learned a long time ago that looking like nothing was the most valuable skill he owned. A door swung open from the kitchen. A young waitress came through carrying 2 plates, moving fast, navigating the tight space between tables with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times in a room this size. She set the plates down in front of the men in the corner without spilling anything, exchanged a word with them too low to hear, and then turned toward the counter. Dominic didn't look up right away. He was reading the handwritten menu card propped against the napkin holder. She stopped on the other side of the counter. He heard her set down a small glass of water. He heard the soft exhale of someone about to ask what you'd like. He looked up. The girl was young, 12, maybe 13. Small for her age, or maybe just fine for her age. He didn't know anymore. He had no frame of reference for what children were supposed to look like at 12. She had dark hair pulled back in a loose braid. She was wearing a plain gray apron over a t-shirt. She had a small notepad in her hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear and an expression of total composure on her face. The expression of a child who had learned early that composure was a skill and had practiced it. And she had eyes the color of winter sky over still water, silver blue, pale and clear, and catching the light from the window in a way that made them seem almost luminous. Dominic forgot what he was looking at. He did not forget things. He was not a man who lost his concentration or allowed his attention to drift. He had sat across tables from people who wanted him dead and held eye contact without blinking. He had listened to men beg for their lives and felt nothing move in him except a cold, calculating stillness. But something happened in the 3 seconds he spent looking at this child's eyes. Something moved. He couldn't have named it. It wasn't recognition exactly. He had never seen her before. He was certain of that. It was more like the sensation of seeing a reflection in an unexpected place, the specific shade of those eyes, the particular way the light found them. He had seen that before. He had seen it every morning in the mirror for 51 years. "Coffee?" she said. Her voice was steady, a little low for her age. No hesitation in it. "Yes," Dominic said. She turned to the machine and he looked away and tried to understand what had just happened in his chest. Nothing, he told himself. Tired. Low blood sugar. Too many hours in a car. The mind starts generating noise when it doesn't have enough legitimate input. He watched her pour the coffee. She moved with a kind of quiet precision, not the anxious precision of someone afraid of making mistakes. The settled precision of someone who had simply done this enough times that mistakes didn't happen anymore. She set the cup in front of him. "You want anything else?" she asked. "There's soup, real broth, not the powder kind." "Soup is fine." She wrote it down. Her handwriting, he noticed, was small and exact. She moved away. He drank the coffee. It was strong and slightly bitter and exactly what he needed. He let it work through him for a minute and told himself to stop thinking about a child's eyes and start thinking about the meeting waiting for him 200 kilometers north. Then a tray of empty glasses came sliding off the edge of the counter. It happened fast. A bus tub left slightly off balance, the girl reaching past it for a cloth, her elbow catching the edge. Dominic was off his stool before the first glass hit the floor. He caught her by the arm, both of them awkward for half a second. Her momentum pulling forward and his hand closing around her forearm to stop her from pitching down onto the broken glass. She steadied. He let go. "Sorry," she said. Not rattled, just quick and practical. "Don't worry about it." But as he let go of her arm, the sleeve of her apron had ridden up, and his eyes dropped to her wrist by reflex, the way a man scans for threats without meaning to, and he saw it. A birthmark. Small. Just above the inside of the wrist, a shade darker than the surrounding skin, oval-shaped with a slight irregularity on the left side. He knew that mark. He had seen it on his father's wrist, on his own, on his sister's, before she died, on photographs of his grandfather taken before the war, a mark that ran through the Vescari bloodline so consistently that his grandfather had called it the family's signature, a private joke that had stopped being funny sometime around the second generation of men who died violently. The girl was already bending to pick up glass shards with a cloth. Dominic stood completely still. He was a man who had built an empire on his ability to process information quickly and without emotion. He was looking at a child with his eyes and his family's birthmark in a cafe in the middle of nowhere, and his brain was doing the arithmetic, and every answer the arithmetic produced was impossible. He sat back down. He picked up his coffee cup. His hand was steady. His face was steady. Every external surface of him was steady. Inside, something had cracked open that he didn't know how to close. The kitchen door swung open again. A woman came through carrying a bowl of soup, moving quickly, already talking. "Ivy, did I hear something break? Are you—" And then she looked up and saw Dominic sitting at the counter, and the bowl of soup went still in her hands, and the sentence dissolved in the air between them like smoke. She was 40 years old or close to it. Dark hair, shorter than he remembered, cut practical and without vanity. fine lines at the corners of her eyes, thinner than she used to be, wearing a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and an apron that matched the girl's. Mara Ellington. The woman he had loved with a recklessness that embarrassed him now to think about. The woman who had vanished from his life 12 years ago without a word, without a note, without a single piece of evidence to explain why she had gone or where. The woman whose disappearance he had spent 2 years trying to investigate and then stopped because the grief of not finding her had started to affect his judgment in ways that cost people around him their lives. The woman he had eventually, painfully, bitterly concluded had chosen to leave. She was standing 8 feet away holding a bowl of soup and looking at him the way people look at things that aren't supposed to exist. Neither of them spoke. The girl, Ivy, looked between them with the sharp attention of a child who has learned to read rooms. One of Dominic's men shifted near the door. He made a small motion with his hand without turning around, a gesture that meant stand down, stay where you are, do nothing. He didn't take his eyes off Mara. Dominic, she said finally. Her voice was low, flat. Whatever she felt was locked somewhere behind it. Mara. 2 syllables. He didn't recognize his own voice saying them. She set the soup bowl on the counter in front of him. Her hands didn't shake, but he could see the effort it took to make that true. She looked at Ivy. Go check on table 3, she said. Mom. Ivy. The girl went. She went slowly, watching them, but she went. Mara came around the end of the counter. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked at his face the way you look at a map of a place you've been lost in, searching, verifying, not yet willing to trust what you're seeing. You're supposed to be dead, she said. I heard the same about you. Something crossed her face that he couldn't read. Pain, maybe. Or something older than pain. How did you find us? Her voice had dropped, barely audible over the coffee machine. I didn't find you. My car needed fuel. She stared at him. That's the truth, he said. Nothing about your life is accidental, Dominic. This was. He held her gaze. Mara. Is she mine? The question landed between them like something physical. He watched her jaw tighten, watched her weigh something. Well, not the answer. He was already certain of the answer. She knew he was certain of the answer. But the cost of saying it out loud, of making it real, of crossing from the world where this was a secret into the world where it wasn't. Yes, she said. One word. The quietest word he had heard in 51 years. He absorbed it. He breathed once, carefully, through his nose. He picked up the coffee cup and set it back down without drinking. 12 years, he said. Yes. She's 12. She turned 12 in March. He looked toward table 3. Ivy was refilling water glasses, her back to them, the braid of dark hair between her shoulder blades, those silver blue eyes somewhere on the other side of her turned-away face. He looked back at Mara. You need to tell me everything, he said. Right now. All of it. Why you left, why you didn't come back, why you never… Not here. Her voice was sharp under the quiet. Not in front of her, not in this room with your men standing at my door. Then where? After closing, 8 o'clock. There's a room in the back. She paused. My men aren't here. I don't have men. It's just me and Ivy, and whatever your convoy does or doesn't do in the next few hours. He understood what she wasn't saying. She wasn't running. She had chosen to stay. That was either courage or exhaustion, and he didn't know yet which one. Fine, he said. He ate the soup. It was good. Real broth, the way she'd said, deep and slightly smoky, with something green he couldn't identify. He ate it without speaking. Mara went back into the kitchen. The older woman by the window paid her bill and left. The 2 men in work clothes finished their soup and went. Cale refueled the SUV from a red container in a shed behind the building. Mara apparently kept fuel on site for whatever the mountain road brought in, and the convoy settled into waiting in the parking area without being asked. Dominic sat at the counter. He watched Ivy work. He watched the way she moved through the room, refilling things, wiping surfaces, answering the door when 2 more travelers came in looking cold and grateful. He watched the way she talked to people. Direct, unhurried, the kind of manner that took most adults decades to develop, and some never did. He watched her carry plates that were heavy for her size without asking for help. He watched her notice when the older man at the new table struggled with the menu and quietly read the items aloud to him without making it obvious, just leaning in and saying them conversationally, moving on before he could be embarrassed. His daughter. He kept running the word against the inside of his skull, and it kept feeling wrong in the way that true things sometimes felt wrong when you encountered them after years of believing the opposite. His daughter, 12 years old, working a cafe counter in the mountains, silver blue eyes and the Viscari birthmark, and a composure that belonged to someone who had been prepared for a harder world than most children faced. He wanted to know everything, what she liked, what she was afraid of, whether she was good in school, whether she read books or what she did with her free time, whether she'd been sick, whether she'd been safe. 12 years of questions lined up behind his sternum like a physical weight. He sat at the counter and said nothing and let the hours pass. At 10 to 8, the last customers left. Ivy collected plates and disappeared into the kitchen. Cale appeared in the doorway, caught Dominic's eye, received a small head shake, and stepped back outside. Mara came out from the kitchen. She had taken off her apron. She didn't look at him right away. "This way," she said. He followed her through the kitchen, clean, small, organized with the precision of someone who had learned to work in tight spaces, and through a door at the back into a room that was clearly a combination of storage and office. A desk with a laptop, metal shelving with supply boxes, a small window looking out at the dark mountain, 2 chairs, mismatched like everything else in this building. She turned around. She crossed her arms. She looked at him the way you look at someone you never planned to explain yourself to because you assumed you'd never see them again. "Sit down," she said. "I'll stand. Suit yourself." She stayed standing too. Outside, wind moved through the pines. The window trembled slightly in its frame. The mountain didn't care about any of it. 12 years ago," she said, "after you disappeared into that war with the Coretti faction. 3 weeks, no word, no contact. You told me you'd be back in 5 days. The operation extended. There were complications. I know that now. I didn't know it then." Her voice was precise, not angry. Anger would have been easier. "I thought you were dead. Then I heard through a contact that you were alive, but that you'd gone dark deliberately, that you'd cut all civilian ties. That's not... I know that now," she said again. "Let me finish." He closed his mouth. "I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after you disappeared. I tried to reach you through every channel I had. Nobody would tell me anything. Then 3 men showed up at my apartment, professional, well-equipped. They weren't there to talk." She stopped. Something moved behind her eyes and went still. "I got out through the fire escape. I had 48 hours and what I could carry." The temperature of the room felt different to Dominic than it had 30 seconds ago. "Who sent them?" he said. "I didn't know then. I've had 12 years to work it out." Her jaw was tight. "But first you tell me something. When I disappeared, what did you find out? What did your people tell you about why I left?" He looked at her. He had never said this to anyone. Not out loud. "I was shown evidence," he said carefully. "Documentation. Suggesting you had passed information to the Coretti faction. That your relationship with me was a placement operation from the beginning." The silence that followed was very complete. "Evidence," Mara said. The word came out flat. "Photographs? Financial records? Communications? And you believed it." He didn't answer. "You believed it," she said again. Not a question this time, just the fact of it, sitting in the room with both of them. "I investigated. You believed it first." Her voice didn't break. It was worse that it didn't break. "You believed it, and that's why you didn't look for me. Or you looked just long enough to confirm what you already decided was true." "The evidence was fabricated," she said. "All of it. Whoever sent those men to my apartment built that evidence first, fed it to you, and then tried to make sure I wasn't alive to contradict it." Dominic stood very still. He was a man who had navigated betrayals for 30 years. He knew what it felt like to have the floor of certainty shift under him. He knew how to stand on unstable ground without showing it. But this was different. This was 12 years of a life he had grieved and closed and built a stone wall around, and the wall was cracking from a specific direction he hadn't expected. "You said you've had time to work out who sent them," he said. "Yes." "Tell me." She looked at him. Something in her expression said she was deciding how much to trust this moment, how much to trust him after everything, and he understood that he had no right to demand that trust and no way to shortcut the fact that he had believed the worst of her for a decade. "I'll tell you," she said, "but first I need you to understand something. Whatever happens tonight, whatever you decide to do with what I tell you, Ivy stays here. This is her home. She has a school. She has a life. You do not get to arrive after 12 years and start making decisions about where she goes." "Mara, that's not negotiable." Her voice was iron. "You want to know the truth? You want to know who tried to have me killed and why? I'll tell you everything I know, but Ivy comes first, always. If you can't agree to that, you can walk back out through my kitchen right now." He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the girl at the counter, reading the menu to a stranger so quietly it looked like conversation. He thought about 12 years of a life he hadn't been there for. He thought about the birthmark on her wrist and the eyes that were his eyes looking at him from a face he had never seen before today. "She comes first," he said. "You have my word." Mara held his gaze like she was checking the tensile strength of something. Then she opened her mouth to tell him the name of the person who had destroyed their lives. And Dominic's phone buzzed. Once, twice. The emergency signal, the pattern that meant something had gone wrong outside right now. The window behind Mara's head exploded inward. The glass came in sideways, not straight through. A rock, not a bullet, which meant someone outside was testing rather than committing. And that distinction mattered because testing meant there was still a window of time before it became something worse. Dominic moved without thinking. He crossed the room in 2 steps and put himself between Mara and the window, his back to the broken frame, glass crunching under his shoes. His hand was already at his side where the holster sat under the jacket. He hadn't drawn yet. Drawing was a decision you couldn't take back. "Down," he said. Mara was already moving. She dropped behind the desk without being told twice, pulling the laptop down with her by reflex. The instinct of someone protecting important things, not the instinct of a civilian who'd never been in a room where windows broke on purpose. He filed that away. His phone was already in his other hand. He pressed the call to Cale. It picked up on half a ring. 3 of them, Cale said. He was breathing controlled. "Tree line, northeast corner. They threw the rock. They haven't moved since. Armed? Can't confirm from here. Santos has an angle on 2 of them. 3rd one's in shadow. Hold. Don't move until I say." He cut the call. Behind the desk, Mara had her knees drawn up and her back against the wood, and she was looking at him with an expression that was not fear. It was something older and more practical than fear. The look of someone running calculations. "This is yours?" she said. Not accusatory, just direct. "I don't know yet." "How many people knew you were on this road?" "Nobody knew I was on this road. We rerouted around a rock slide." She processed that. Her jaw shifted slightly. "Then they weren't following you." "Or they were, and they're very good." "They threw a rock," she said. "If they were very good, they wouldn't have thrown a rock." He looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. A precision team doesn't telegraph. A precision team doesn't stand in a tree line and throw something through a back window like a warning. A precision team comes in quiet and comes in final. "You've had trouble before," he said. "I've always had trouble." She said it the way you say something that stopped being surprising a long time ago. "Every 2 or 3 years. Someone comes around asking questions. A man sits too long in a parked car on the road out front. Once, 7 years ago, someone tried to follow Ivy home from school." Her voice didn't change on that last part, but something behind her eyes got very hard and very still. "I dealt with it." "How?" "I moved. The next week. New town, new name, new school. I've done it 6 times. 6 times. He absorbed that. 6 times in 12 years she had packed up whatever life she'd built and rebuilt it somewhere else, pulling a child out of school, away from whatever friendships she'd managed to form, dragging her up another mountain road to another anonymous place because someone, somewhere, kept finding them. "How long have you been here?" he said. 2 years. It's the longest we've stayed anywhere. Ivy knows? She knows we move when we have to. She stopped asking why. Mara's mouth tightened. She's 12 years old, and she stopped asking why. That's on me. I know that's on me. Another message from Cale. Dominic read it fast. Third man moved, coming around the south side toward the kitchen door. "Stay here," he said. "Where are you?" He was already through the kitchen door. The kitchen was dark. He hadn't turned the lights on, and didn't now. He moved along the wall to the exterior door, the one that opened onto the back of the building, the one that faced the mountain. He stood to the side of it and listened. Footsteps on gravel. Careful. Trying to be quiet and almost managing it. He waited. The door handle moved. Whoever it was had something to pick locks with, or had found it unlocked. Mara probably didn't lock her back door. You didn't lock your back door when you lived somewhere that felt remote enough to be safe. A mistake that cost people sometimes. He stayed flat against the wall. The door came open. A man stepped through. Dominic had him by the collar and the wrist before he'd cleared the frame, spinning him into the wall, the man's face hitting the tile above the counter with a sound that was not gentle. The gun that had been in the man's hand hit the floor. Dominic kicked it sideways and got the man's arm up behind his back at an angle that made further resistance a question of how much pain he was willing to accept. The man made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound. "Who sent you?" Dominic said. Silence. Labored breathing. Sweat smell. Dominic increased the pressure on the arm. "I'll ask once more. We're not—" The man's voice was muffled against the wall. Young. Younger than Dominic expected. "We're not here for you. We don't even know who you are." "Then who are you here for?" A pause that was a second too long. "The woman," the man said. "The one who runs this place." Dominic's grip didn't loosen, but something shifted in him. He kept his voice flat. "Who told you to come here?" "I don't know the name, I swear. We got a call, we got paid, we got an address. That's it. I swear on my so—" "Don't," Dominic said. He didn't want to hear what the man was going to swear on. "Describe the voice on the call." Male, older, spoke slow, like someone used to giving orders and not repeating them. Dominic filed that. "You were supposed to do what, exactly?" "Scare her," the man said. That was the word. Scare her enough to move on, same as we were told before. Before. Dominic caught that word and held it. How many times before? "I don't know. This is the second time for me. 2 years ago, different location, same client, same type of job." So Mara was right. The threat followed her. It had been following her for years, not with lethal intent, not consistently, but with the specific patience of someone who wanted her moving, kept off balance, never settled, never stable enough to start asking the right questions or finding the right people to ask them of. That was not the method of an enemy who wanted her dead. That was the method of someone managing a problem. He pulled the man off the wall by the collar and walked him back through the kitchen door and into the storage room. Mara was on her feet. She saw the man and her expression did something complicated. Recognition, maybe, or the recognition of a type, if not a specific face. Cale appeared in the doorway behind Dominic. He had the other 2 men with him, both of them zip-tied at the wrists with the kind of efficiency that suggested the interaction outside had been brief and uncomfortable for them. He looked at the situation and said nothing, which was one of the reasons Dominic had kept him employed for 15 years. Mara looked at the 3 men. She looked at Dominic. 2 years ago, she said to the man he was holding, "Someone paid you to scare me. What town?" The man's eyes shifted to Dominic as if looking for permission to answer. Dominic tightened his grip once by way of response. "Harlan Creek," the man said. "Little place off Route 9. You had a house at the end of a dead-end road." Mara's face went still. "That was the night," she said, quietly. Not to anyone in particular. "That was the night Ivy had pneumonia. I thought I was imagining things. I thought I was tired and scared and seeing problems that weren't there." She stopped. "I pulled her out of the hospital. I moved us in 3 days. She was still running a fever. Dominic looked at her. He thought about a 12-year-old girl with a fever being loaded into a car in the middle of the night because someone had stood in a tree line and thrown a rock. He thought about what that did to a child's nervous system over a decade. He thought about Ivy's composure at the counter, so practiced and settled it had looked like maturity, and understood now that it was something different. It was armor. It was the armor you built when the world had taught you that the ground could shift under your feet without warning, and the only reliable response was to never let anyone see you stumble. Get them out of here, he said to Cale. Keep them separate. I'll deal with it in the morning. Cale moved. The men went without significant resistance. The room was quieter. Mara sat down in one of the mismatched chairs. She sat the way people sit when they've been running on adrenaline for 2 hours and it's just run out. Not collapsed, not broken, just suddenly, completely empty. You were going to tell me a name, Dominic said. He sat in the other chair without asking. Before the window. Yes, tell me now. She looked at the floor for a moment, then she looked at him. I don't have proof. What I have is 12 years of thinking and pattern recognition and one conversation I overheard 6 months ago when a man came in here asking questions about the Vescari family and didn't know I was in the back. What did you hear? He was on the phone. He didn't know I was there. He said, she stopped, chose her words. He said the bloodline problem was still unresolved. Those words exactly, bloodline problem. That's not a name. I know, but I recognize the voice on the other end of the call, just barely, just a few seconds of it through a phone speaker in a back room. She paused. It sounded like Lucien. The name hit Dominic somewhere in the solar plexus. Lucien is dead, he said. I know what they told you. I was told he died in the Succession War. There was a, I know what you were told. Her voice was patient. The patience of someone who has been living with a truth that nobody else would believe. I know there was a body. I know there was a funeral. I know everyone in the organization accepted it as fact. She held his gaze. But Dominic, you know that man. You knew him for 30 years. The voice I heard, the rhythm of it, the cadence, the way it dropped at the end of a sentence, it was through a phone speaker in a back room. Yes. 6 months ago. Yes. He stood up. He couldn't stay in the chair. He walked to the window, the broken one, and looked out at the mountain dark and the pines moving in the wind and tried to apply the same cold logic he applied to everything to what she had just told him. Lucien Vescari, his father's brother. The man who had mentored him, advised him, sat at his right hand through the transition years when Dominic had taken over the family operation, and every rival organization in the region had lined up to test whether the son was weaker than the father. Lucien had been steady through all of it, reliable in the way that mountains are reliable, always there, always the same, always solid under your feet, except there had been moments, specific moments over the years, that he had archived without analysis because they hadn't seemed to require it. The night Mara disappeared, Lucien had been the first to show Dominic the so-called evidence. Lucien had framed the narrative. Here's what happened, here's what she was, here's what it means, now let's move forward. Dominic had been raw enough and angry enough and grieving enough that he'd taken the frame at face value, and Lucien had died 18 months later. An ambush in the Eastern District, a body identified by two witnesses who were both dead within the year for unrelated reasons. He turned back from the window. Why didn't you tell someone? He said. If you suspected Lucien, even a suspicion, why not reach out? You could have what? Mara's voice had an edge in it now. The exhaustion had burned off, and something harder was underneath. Reached out to who? The organization that he built his influence inside? Used the channels that he spent 30 years learning to control? Gone to the police with the story that the dead uncle of a crime family patriarch was secretly alive and had been trying to erase his nephew's girlfriend and unborn child for over a decade? She spread her hands. Who would have believed me, Dominic? Who did I have? I had Ivy, and I had whatever I could build with my own hands. And that was it. He didn't answer because there was no answer. She was right. She had been right about everything, consistently, for 12 years, and nobody had been in a position to tell her that or help her because nobody had known. She doesn't know any of this, Mara said. Her voice was quieter now. Ivy, she doesn't know who you are. She doesn't know who I was before this. She doesn't know why we move. She has built her entire life on the foundation of not knowing. And every year I've told myself she was safer not knowing. And I've been looking at that getting less and less true every year. She needs to know, Dominic said. I know she needs to know. Mara's voice fractured slightly on that. Only slightly. I know that, I don't know how to start that conversation. I don't know where the beginning of it is. A sound from the kitchen. Both of them went still. Then Ivy's voice, quiet and direct. You could start with who he is. She was standing in the kitchen doorway. She had her arms folded across her chest, and her silver blue eyes were moving between them with an expression that was not childlike at all. Not the expression of a kid who'd wandered in by accident, but the expression of someone who had been outside that door long enough to hear what they needed to hear and had decided to stop pretending otherwise. Mara got to her feet. Ivy? I heard the window break, Ivy said. I heard the men. I'm not stupid. She looked at Dominic. You're not just some customer who needed fuel. No, Dominic said. Then who are you? He looked at her. He looked at those eyes and the set of her jaw, and the way she stood with her weight distributed like someone who had decided not to be scared and was holding the decision with both hands. He looked at Mara. Mara's face said, it's your choice, which was either generosity or the thing you said when you were too tired to carry the moment yourself. My name is Dominic Vescari, he said. Ivy absorbed that. No recognition of the name. Good. It meant Mara had kept that distance carefully. Bad. It meant he was starting from zero. Okay, Ivy said. Why are there men in zip ties outside? Because they were going to scare your mother. Why? Because someone wants her to keep moving, to keep not settling, to keep not having the time or the stability to look too carefully at who's been making that happen. Ivy's eyes moved to Mara. Something passed between them. The particular frequency of a child and a parent who have learned to communicate in shorthand because they've had to. Is this the thing you've been not telling me? Ivy said. Yes, Mara said. All of it? Or just part of it? Most of it. Ivy unfolded her arms. She walked into the room and sat down on a supply box and put her hands on her knees with the posture of someone settling in for something difficult. Okay, she said. Tell me. All of it. Mara looked at Dominic. He saw something in her face that he hadn't seen in 12 years because he hadn't been there to see it. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been the only adult in a situation that required two and had never said so out loud. We should sit, he said. They sat. All three of them in the small back room with the broken window and the mountain wind coming through and the single overhead light making the shadows sharp. Outside, Cale's men were dealing with 3 hired scare merchants in the parking lot. In the cafe, chairs were still pushed back from tables that hadn't been cleared yet, coffee cups still half full, the last of the evening sitting there unharvested. Mara started talking. She started from before Ivy, before the disappearance, before the fabricated evidence, and the assassins and the 6 towns and the 6 schools, and the 6 times she had packed 2 bags in the night with a child who had stopped asking why. She started from the beginning. Ivy listened. She didn't interrupt. She asked one question. Once, about 12 minutes in, when Mara described the men who had come to her apartment in the city. And the question was, were you hurt? Not were you scared? Were you hurt? The distinction of a child who had been taught by experience that fear was manageable and physical harm was the real variable. No, Mara said. I got out. Okay, Ivy said, and let her continue. Dominic watched his daughter listen to the story of her own origin and tried to catalog what he saw in her face. Not shock. Not the theatrical disbelief of someone whose worldview had just been dismantled. Something more interior than that. The steady, careful work of someone integrating new information into an existing framework, finding the places where the new thing fit, where it explained what had always been slightly unexplained. At the end, Ivy was quiet for a long time. Then she looked at Dominic. So you're my father? Yes. And you didn't know about me? No. And you didn't know she was alive? I was told she had betrayed me. I eventually believed it. Another pause. Ivy's jaw did the same thing he had watched Mara's jaw do. A controlled tightening, the physical sign of something being processed and contained. That's a lot of time to lose, she said. Yes. Whose fault is it? Dominic looked at her. He thought about a careful answer. He thought about all the ways you could frame blame across a decade of deliberate deception and counter-deception, and the specific cruelties of men who moved other people's lives around like pieces on a board. Someone made it happen on purpose, he said, but I made it easier for them than I should have. Both things are true. Ivy looked at him for another long moment with those eyes that were his eyes and her mother's intelligence behind them. Okay, she said. What happens now? Before Dominic could answer, his phone lit up. He looked at the screen. The number was blocked, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the identifier that came with it, a 3-digit code that only existed inside the Viscari communication system, a code that meant the message came from inside the family's own infrastructure. He opened the message. 4 words. No signature, no context. She was never safe. He stared at the screen. Then a second message, 30 seconds behind the first. Neither is the girl. Come home, Dominic. Bring them. We've been waiting a long time for this reunion. He put the phone in his pocket. Mara was watching his face. She had learned to read him once and apparently hadn't forgotten how. What? She said. He looked at Ivy. He looked at Mara. He thought about 3 hired men in a parking lot who had been sent not to kill but to push. And he thought about the specific patience of someone who had spent 12 years managing a problem rather than eliminating it. And he thought about the word reunion in a message from inside his own infrastructure. And he understood that whatever he had walked into this building, believing about his organization, about his security, about the completeness of his information about the world, all of it was wrong. We have to move, he said. Right now, tonight. Move where? Mara was already standing. My estate. It's the only place I can guarantee. No. Her voice was flat and immediate. No, that's what the message wants. Whatever you just read, someone just told you to bring us to your estate. That's what they want. Us in one place. A place they know the layout of. She was right again. He hated that she was right again, and had been right continuously for 12 years without anyone to tell her so. Then where? He said. She looked at him. She looked at Ivy. She said, I have an address. I've kept it for emergencies. A contact I trust. Someone who used to work with the organization before you were in charge. Before all of this. She stopped. Her face changed. Something in it went very careful and very slow. Someone who warned me, she said, a long time ago. Someone who told me that if I ever needed to disappear for real, not just move towns, but really disappear, this was where to go. Who? Dominic said. His name is Aldrich Penn, she said. He used to be your uncle's private... She stopped. She stopped because both of them heard it at the same time. The sound from outside, not gravel under shoes, not the wind in the pines, but the specific sound of a vehicle moving without lights, rolling slow on the mountain road, the particular sound of something that doesn't want to be heard. More than one vehicle. Cale's voice came through Dominic's earpiece, tight and controlled. We have company. At least 4 cars coming up the south approach. These aren't amateurs. Dominic looked at Mara. Mara looked at Ivy. Ivy looked at the window and said quietly, with the composure of someone who had stopped being surprised by the ground shifting under her feet, There's a way out through the cold storage. Leads to a path up the north face. I know where it comes out. Both adults stared at her. I've always known it, she said simply. In case. In case. 2 words that held 12 years inside them. 12 years of a mother who had moved 6 times, and a daughter who had learned to map the exits of every room she ever entered, who had stopped asking why and started preparing instead, who had built her composure out of the same material her mother had built her survival out of, the absolute refusal to be caught without a way out. Dominic looked at his daughter, and for the first time since he had walked into this cafe looking for nothing more than fuel and silence, he felt something that wasn't grief or calculation or the cold management of threat. He felt something that felt, uncomfortably, like pride. "Show us," he said. Ivy moved, and somewhere in the convoy coming up the mountain without lights, someone who had been patient for 12 years had finally decided that patience was finished. The cold storage was exactly what the name said. A narrow room behind the kitchen, 8 feet wide, walls lined with metal shelving holding dry goods and canned stock. The temperature 10 degrees lower than the rest of the building and smelling of cardboard and old wood. At the back wall, behind a shelving unit that Ivy moved with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this, was a door. Low frame, heavy hinges. The kind of door that had been built into a building before the building had a proper purpose, a remnant of something older underneath. Ivy pushed it open without hesitation, and cold mountain air came through. Dominic looked at the opening and looked at his daughter, and didn't say anything about the fact that she had identified this exit and memorized the path beyond it, and kept both pieces of information to herself for long enough that they had become reflexive. There was nothing to say about it that wasn't going to take longer than they had. "North face path," he said. "How far to the road?" 20 minutes on foot. Maybe 15 if we don't use lights." She paused. "It's steep in the middle section. Can you do it?" She gave him a look that was so precisely the look he himself gave people who asked stupid questions that it startled him. "I've done it before," she said. He got Cale on the earpiece. "North face. Get one vehicle up the back road and meet us at the tree line above the property. Leave the others to hold the south approach. Make it look like we're still inside." "Copy." A beat. "Dominic. These aren't local hired hands, tactical gear, coordinated positioning. Whoever's running this spent real money." "I know. Go." Mara had a bag. She had produced it from somewhere in the back room. Small, military style, already packed. The kind of bag you keep ready because you have learned that ready is the only thing that saves you. She had it on her shoulder before Dominic had finished the call with Kyle. 12 years of practice. He tried not to think about what that meant. They went through the door. The mountain at night was a different country. The path was barely visible, a worn line in the dirt and pine needles, the kind of trail made by one person walking it repeatedly rather than by design. No lighting, no markings. The pines closed over them almost immediately, and the sounds from the road below fell away into the white noise of wind in high branches. Ivy went first. She moved fast and without hesitation, her feet finding the path by memory in the dark, ducking under a low branch here, stepping wide around a root there. Mara followed. Dominic came last, watching their backs, one hand on the phone, the other near the holster. Below them, on the south approach road, headlights swept across the tree line as the convoy arrived. He could hear, faint and flat through the mountain air, the sound of car doors. Voices. The organized noise of a tactical entry team moving on a building they expected to find occupied. He kept climbing. The middle section of the path was steep enough that Mara had to use her free hand on the slope. Dominic stayed close behind her without touching her, close enough to catch if she slipped. She didn't slip. She climbed with the efficiency of someone in decent physical condition who had done hard things in the dark before. Ivy reached the crest first and stopped, crouching, looking down the other side. She turned and held up a hand. "Wait." And they waited, the three of them in a line on the dark hillside, breathing hard from the climb, listening. Nothing from the other side of the ridge. Dominic moved up beside Ivy and looked. The back road was a pale gray line through the trees below. No lights, no movement. Then headlights appeared at the far end, moving slow, and he recognized the shape of the vehicle and the pattern of how Cale drove and let out a breath he had been keeping for 20 minutes. "That's us," he said. They went down. The vehicle was an unremarkable SUV, not one from the original convoy, a second-layer asset that Cale maintained in the region for contingencies. Cale was driving. One other man in the back, one of the better ones, someone Dominic had trusted for years. The back doors opened before they reached it. Ivy got in. Mara got in. Dominic got in last and pulled the door, and Cale had them moving before it fully closed. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. The road descended in sharp switchbacks, the headlights cutting small pieces of the dark ahead. Dominic watched the side mirror. Nothing followed. Whatever team had arrived at the cafe was still there, working through a building they'd found empty, which bought time but not much. Ivy was sitting behind Kale, her bag on her lap, her face turned toward the window, watching the mountain go past. Her posture was contained, but Dominic could see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her hands weren't quite still on the bag strap. Not panic. Something more controlled than panic. The effort of keeping it controlled. He wanted to say something to her. He didn't know what. The vocabulary for this situation didn't exist in any version of him. Mara spoke quietly without turning from her window. "Where are we going?" "Safe house in the valley," Dominic said. "It's clean. Nobody in my current network knows the address. I acquired it through a separate channel 3 years ago. Standard precaution." "Standard precaution for what?" "For a situation where my current network couldn't be trusted." She turned from the window and looked at him. "You've been planning for that," she said. "Not a question." "I've been planning for everything," he said. "It's what I do." "Has it occurred to you," Mara said, her voice dropping just slightly below the road noise, "that the message you received tonight came from inside your own infrastructure? Your own communication system?" "Yes. And that means someone inside your organization, someone with access to your internal codes, has known about us? Has known about Ivy?" "Yes." "For how long?" He looked at her. "I don't know yet." Mara turned back to the window. The muscle in her jaw worked once and went still. Ivy said from the back, "Is Aldrich Penn still someone we should go to?" Both adults looked at her. "You heard that part," Mara said. "I heard most of it, the part through the door before I came in." No apology in her voice, just fact. "Penn worked for Lucien. You said Penn warned you, but if Lucien is alive and Lucien is behind this, then Penn's warning might have been part of the management," Dominic said. He said it carefully because saying it meant following the logic of it, and the logic of it kept opening into worse and worse spaces. "Give you a place to go. A contact who reports back. Keep you moving in a direction they chose." Ivy absorbed that. "So we don't go to Penn?" "No." "Then the safe house," she said. "And then what?" Dominic didn't answer right away. The road leveled out as they came off the mountain and the valley opened ahead, dark farmland on both sides. A small cluster of lights in the distance that was a town he didn't plan to go into. He was running the architecture of this in his head. Who had what information, where the access points were? Which of the people he had trusted for decades had access to the communication codes that had sent that message? And how many of them had been in contact with Lucien at any point in the last 12 years? The list of names was not comfortable to look at. "Then we find out how deep this goes," he said. The safe house was a farmhouse set back from a county road, surrounded by fields that hadn't been actively farmed in several years. Low profile, unremarkable, the kind of place that nobody looked at twice. Dominic had the key on his person and the alarm code memorized, and neither existed in any digital record he was aware of. Cale pulled into the barn adjacent to the house, rather than the driveway, which was correct procedure and which Dominic appreciated without saying so. They went into the house through the connecting door. The inside was plain. Functional furniture, a kitchen stocked with long shelf supplies, bedrooms on the upper floor, a secure room in the basement with communication equipment and a weapons locker. Ivy looked at the interior with an expression that suggested she had been in versions of this room before. She probably had. "There's a room upstairs on the left," Dominic said. "It's the most interior room, no exterior wall exposure." "I know what that means," Ivy said. She went upstairs. Mara watched her go. Something in her face was very tired. "She's been ready for a room like this her whole life," Mara said. "I told myself I was protecting her. Every time I chose not to explain, I told myself she was safer not knowing, and all I actually did was make her prepare for danger in complete silence because she wasn't allowed to know what the danger was." "You kept her alive," Dominic said. "That's a low bar." "It's not." She looked at him. "Don't defend my choices to me, Dominic. You weren't there for any of them." He took that. He stood in the middle of someone else's farmhouse kitchen at 1:30 in the morning and took it because it was accurate. "I need to make contact," he said. "There are 2 people inside my organization that I would stake my life on. I need to reach them without using any channel that's been compromised. How do you know which channels that is? I don't, so I'll use none of them. He looked at Cale, who had posted himself near the door. The Bryn Protocol. You remember it. Cale's expression shifted slightly. The Bryn Protocol was something they had designed 7 years ago as a pure contingency, a method of reaching specific individuals through entirely analog means, no digital trail, no organizational infrastructure, physical dead drops, and pre-established in-person contact points that had never been written down anywhere. Dominic had built it because he had always understood, in the abstract, that the day might come when the organization itself became the threat. He had hoped, abstractly, to never need it. I remember it, Cale said. Go. Cale went. The man in the back seat stayed. His name was Torres, and he had been with Dominic for 8 years, and had once taken a bullet in the shoulder that had been meant for Dominic without flinching or complaining or using it as leverage afterward, which was the kind of thing you didn't forget. Dominic sat at the kitchen table. Mara sat across from him. The house was quiet except for the wind outside and the occasional sound from upstairs, Ivy moving around, the creak of the floor, and neither of them spoke for a while. Then Mara said, "Tell me about Lucien." He looked at her. "Not what happened," she said. "Not the facts. Tell me what he was like, who he was to you, because if I'm right about what I heard, if he's been alive for 12 years running this, I want to understand what kind of man does that." Dominic was quiet for a moment. "He was the only constant," he said. "After my father died and the transition was rough, there were a lot of people who wanted to see me fail. He was the one who stayed, who advised, who knew the organization's history and the people in it and who could be trusted and who couldn't." "Who told you who could be trusted?" Mara said slowly. He stopped. She was watching him. Careful. Not unkind. The way you watch someone walk toward the edge of something they can't see yet. "He managed your information," she said, "from the beginning. He decided what you knew about your own people. I verified through channels he had access to." She kept her voice level. "Dominic, I'm not saying you were stupid. I'm saying he was very good and he had 30 years of access and he knew exactly how you thought because he helped shape how you thought." The kitchen was very quiet. He had built an empire on the certainty of his own judgment. He had made decisions that cost people their lives and their freedom based on his assessment of information he believed he had gathered and verified independently. He had looked men in the face and known whether they were lying or believed he had known, and acted on that belief without hesitation. And underneath all of it, for 30 years, someone had been selecting which information reached him. He didn't say anything. He looked at the table surface. Mara said, "How many decisions did you make based on what Lucien told you, or what he showed you, or who he vouched for?" "Stop. I'm not trying to... I know what you're trying to do, and I need you to stop for a moment." His voice was controlled, completely controlled, nothing in the surface of it, but his hands were flat on the table in a way that was slightly too deliberate. "Give me a minute." She gave him the minute. He used it to go back through specific memories with the specific questions she had asked. Decisions based on Lucien's intelligence, vouched relationships, information that had come through Lucien's channel or been framed by Lucien's interpretation. He went back 5 years, 10 years, 15. He went back to before the succession. He went back to his father's era when Lucien had been advising the previous generation and Dominic had been learning the operation from the inside out, learning it partly through Lucien's instruction. The list was very long. The list was, in fact, most of his adult life. "There's a man named Rourke," he said, "Gerald Rourke. He's run my Eastern operations for 11 years. Lucien vouched for him when I was considering the placement. Said he'd known the family for decades. Reliable, loyal to the bloodline. And? Rourke is the only person in my organization outside of Kyle who has access to the internal communication codes. The tier that the message came from tonight." Mara looked at him. "Rourke?" she said. "Yes." "And Lucien vouched for him?" "Yes." She put both hands on the table. She breathed in slowly and out slowly. "So the message didn't just come from inside your infrastructure. It came from a man who was placed there by the person we think is behind all of this." It appears so. Dominic, her voice was very careful. If Rourke has been Lucien's placement for 11 years, if he's had access to your communication systems for 11 years, then he knows your safe houses. The air in the room changed temperature. Dominic was already on his feet. Torres. His voice came out flat and immediate. Get upstairs. Stay with Ivy. Don't open the door for anything that isn't my voice. Torres moved without a word. Dominic's phone was in his hand. He was trying to reach Cale and simultaneously processing the geometry of the situation. The farmhouse acquisition 3 years ago had been arranged through a separate channel. He had been careful. He had been methodical. He had used intermediaries specifically to keep it out of the main infrastructure. But intermediaries had identities, transactions left traces, and a man who had spent 11 years inside the Viscari communication system would know how to look for traces. Cale picked up on the second ring. The Bryn contact, Dominic started. Already there. Cale's voice was strange. Dominic, I'm here. There's a problem. What problem? A pause. 3 seconds. In 12 years of working together, Cale had never paused before answering him. The contact is dead, Cale said. Has been for a while. Days, maybe. And Dominic, there's something here you need to see. I'm sending it now. His phone buzzed. He opened the file. It was a photograph. Taken inside what appeared to be a private office. Wood-paneled walls, heavy furniture. The kind of room that announced old money and patience. In the center of the photograph, seated at a desk, was a man. He was older than Dominic remembered. Considerably older. The hair was white now, and the face had settled into the deep lines that came with age and with whatever 12 years of living in deliberate concealment did to a man's face. The body was thinner, the posture was more careful, but the eyes were the same, pale gray. Patient. The eyes of a man who had never in his life been surprised by human behavior because he had spent his entire life engineering it. Lucien Viscari was alive. He was sitting at a desk in what the metadata of the photograph would later confirm was a building 60 kilometers north of the farmhouse. He was alive and upright and had the particular ease of a man sitting in a room that belonged to him, surrounded by things he had accumulated over years, in a position of settled authority. He was also, in the photograph, looking directly at the camera, not the accidental gaze of someone photographed unaware. The direct, deliberate eye contact of someone who knew the photograph was being taken and had decided to look. On the desk in front of him was a single piece of paper. Dominic zoomed in on it. Handwritten. The handwriting he recognized. He had seen it on documents for 30 years, on organizational notes and personal correspondence, and the occasional letter that Lucien had sent him during the transition years when written communication had felt safer than digital. The message was 3 sentences. You found her by accident. I've been watching you look for 12 years. Now bring her home and we can finish this the right way, or I'll finish it the way I started, without you in the picture. Dominic stared at the screen. He looked at the word watching. He looked at the phrase 12 years. He turned the photograph over in his mind. The office, the desk, the deliberate eye contact, the handwritten note placed for the camera's benefit. This was not the communication of a man operating in fear or in hiding. This was the communication of a man who had been comfortable for a very long time and wanted someone to know it. You found her by accident, which meant Lucien knew about tonight, knew about the café, the rock through the window, the convoy on the mountain road. Had monitoring in place that covered even the accidental stop at a nameless building on a rerouted mountain drive. I've been watching you look for 12 years. Which meant he had known, the entire time, that Dominic had been looking. That the investigation Dominic had quietly maintained, the private searches, the occasional inquiry through trusted channels, Lucien had watched all of it, had watched him come close and steered him away, presumably, had watched him grieve and had let him grieve, had watched him build the stone wall around it and had let him build that too because a man with a stone wall around his grief doesn't look too carefully at the evidence that built it, without you in the picture. The euphemism was precise, not vague, precise, the kind of precision that came from a man who had decided on the nature of the threat being made and wanted no ambiguity about it. Mara was looking at his face. "What is it?" she said. He turned the phone screen toward her. She read it. He watched her read it. He watched her face go through several things in the space of about 15 seconds. Recognition of the name at the top, the processing of the message's content, the specific moment when the last sentence landed, and her expression went very still in a way that was not calm, but was the surface over something that was not calm. She put the phone down on the table. "He's known where we were," she said. "The cafe." "Yes. For how long before tonight, I don't know." "He let us run." Her voice was flat. "All of it. Every time we moved, every town, every school, he let it happen. He could have—" She stopped. "He let me run because it was useful, because a woman running from town to town doesn't look carefully at who's behind her, because a woman running is busy surviving and not busy investigating." She looked at her hands on the table. "I spent 12 years being managed." "You survived," he said. "Don't." Her voice was sharp, clean, cut right through the air between them. "Don't give me that again. I'm not looking for comfort, and I don't want any. I want to know what we do now." He looked at her, and he looked at the phone, and he looked at the staircase that led to the room where his daughter and Torres were waiting behind a closed door, and he tried to find the version of himself that had clear answers. The version that had sat across tables from men who wanted him dead, and always had a move. He couldn't find it right now. He was looking at a photograph of a man who had spent 30 years inside his confidence and 12 years watching from the shadow of his own death, and the full weight of what that meant. Every decision, every relationship, every piece of intelligence he had ever acted on was sitting on his chest like a structural load. But underneath the weight, something was shifting. Something cold and specific was taking shape in the place where grief and shock were starting to burn off. Not a plan yet. Not even the outline of a plan. Just the beginning of a particular kind of anger. Not the hot, reckless anger of immediate threat, but the deep architectural anger of a man who understood precisely the dimensions of what had been done to him and was beginning to measure it. "There are two things Lucian doesn't know," Dominic said. His voice was quiet, even. Mara looked at him. "He knows I was looking for you," he said. "He doesn't know what you told me tonight. He doesn't know what you heard 6 months ago. The phone call, the voice, the words. He built this on the assumption that you have nothing except survival instinct and I have nothing except grief. He doesn't know that between us we have—" "A partial case against him," Mara said. "A starting point. And the second thing—" He stopped. Footsteps on the stairs. Both of them looked up. Ivy came into the kitchen. She had her bag. Her shoes were on. Her face was the face of someone who had been listening through a floor. "I heard," she said preemptively. "I'm not sorry." Neither of them had the bandwidth to address that. "The second thing Lucian doesn't know," Dominic said, looking at his daughter, "is what she can do." Ivy held his gaze. "You don't know what I can do either." "No," he said. "But I know what you've already done, and I know where the exits are in buildings you've never been in before." He picked up his phone. "Get your bag. We have about 40 minutes before someone figures out where this house is." "Where are we going?" Ivy said. "To the one person in my organization who I believe Lucian never got to, who I believe he couldn't get to, because this person came in after the succession, after Lucian was supposedly dead, through a channel Lucian didn't build." He was already moving through the kitchen toward the door to the barn, phone to his ear. "Her name is Senna Voss. She runs my legitimate business infrastructure. She's never had a reason to lie to me, and she's never had contact with anyone from the old network." "Never had contact that you know of," Mara said. "Yes." He stopped at the door. "Everything from here is that qualifier. Everything I think I know carries that qualifier until I can verify it." He looked at her. She looked at him. 12 years of silence and loss, and the deliberate machinery of a dead man standing between them and whatever they had been before it. And here was the specific architecture of where they were now. No safe ground, no trusted infrastructure. A 12-year-old who had mapped exits in buildings she'd never been in, and a man who had just discovered that his entire empire might be built on intelligence that someone else had filtered for him since before he could vote. "I spent 30 years, he said quietly, believing I was the most dangerous person in any room I walked into." Mara looked at him. Something in her expression was not unkind. "You probably still are," she said. The question is whether that's going to be enough. From the road outside, distant but approaching, came the sound of an engine, then two engines, the particular cadence of vehicles that were not slowing down. Ivy was already at the barn door. We're out of time, she said without turning around, with the flat certainty of someone who was done being surprised by that sentence and had decided to simply treat it as a constant condition. The barn smelled of old hay and motor oil, and the particular cold of a building that hadn't held animals in years. Cale's SUV was still there. Torres had the keys and had it running before the barn door was fully open, exhaust rising white in the dark, the engine sound too loud, and then normalizing as Torres got it down to idle. Dominic got in front, Mara and Ivy in the back. South Road, Dominic said. The vehicles coming in are on the South Road, Torres said. How far? 2 minutes, maybe less. Then go north and cut through the service track behind the east field. It comes out on the county road 3 kilometers up. Torres went. The SUV bounced hard over uneven ground as they left the barn's gravel apron and hit the field edge, the headlights off, Torres navigating by the pale moonlight that came and went between cloud cover. In the back seat, Ivy braced herself against the door with one hand and held her bag with the other and made no sound. Mara had her hand flat against the seat back in front of her and was looking out the rear window at the farmhouse lights receding. 2 sets of headlights appeared on the south approach, moving fast, not cautious anymore. Torres found the service track and the ride smooth slightly, packed dirt, ruts but manageable, and then they were behind the tree line and the farmhouse was out of sight, and the headlights behind them were blocked by the intervening field. Nobody spoke for 4 minutes. Then the county road appeared ahead, and Torres pulled onto it and accelerated to something that felt like a normal speed, and the inside of the vehicle settled into the specific quiet of people who have just exited immediate danger and are now in the liminal space between that and whatever comes next. Dominic's phone was in his hand. He was composing a message using a method that had nothing to do with the Viscari infrastructure, a private account, a number that existed in no organizational record, a line of communication he had maintained for years, the way a careful man keeps cash in a place his accountant doesn't know about. Not because he had planned for this specific scenario, but because he had always understood in the abstract that trust had a shelf life. The message went to one number, Senevos, 4 words, Bryn, now, original point. The original point was a coffee shop in the financial district of the city, 200 kilometers south. A place he and Senna had met twice before for reasons unrelated to the organization. Once for a legitimate business review that he had insisted on conducting off-site. Once for a conversation about the restructuring of the foundation that he hadn't wanted on record. She would know what the message meant. If she was compromised, she would respond in a way he could read. If she wasn't, she would be there. He put the phone away. Tell me about Sina Voss, Mara said from the back seat. Not asking for reassurance, asking for information. The distinction was important, and he heard it. 43. She came up through the legitimate side, foundation management, corporate structure, investment portfolio oversight. She's been running the legal infrastructure for 6 years. She's never had a reason to know the operational side of the organization in detail, and I've kept it that way. That's not a personality, Mara said. Tell me who she is. He thought about it. Precise. Unsentimental. She's told me I was wrong about things on 4 separate occasions in 6 years and been right all 4 times. She doesn't adjust her assessment based on what I want to hear. You trust her. More than almost anyone still living, Ivy said from behind him. How did Lucien stay hidden for 12 years? The question landed in the vehicle and nobody answered it immediately because it was the right question and it didn't have a comfortable answer. Resources, Dominic said finally. Money, infrastructure, loyal people. He had 30 years to build relationships inside the organization before his supposed death. He had access to everything. Personnel files, financial accounts, safe house locations, communication protocols. When he disappeared, he took all of that knowledge with him. He didn't need to stay inside the organization. He just needed to stay connected to the right people inside it. Like Rourke, Ivy said. Like Rourke. How many others? That's what I need Senna to help me figure out. The road south was clear at this hour. Torres drove at a speed that was fast without being memorable. The mountain fell away behind them, and the valley opened into the broader lowland geography of the region, farmland giving way to light industrial at the edges of small towns, the occasional gas station burning bright in the dark. At the 3-hour mark, they crossed into the city's outer ring. Dawn was beginning to suggest itself in the east, not yet visible, but the quality of the dark had changed from absolute to merely very deep. Torres found a parking structure 6 blocks from the coffee shop and pulled in. They sat for a moment. "She'll be there at 7, Dominic said. "We have 40 minutes. "And if she's not alone," Mara said, "then we leave and I've lost my last clean asset inside the organization and we figure out the next step from there." Mara nodded. She was looking at the concrete wall of the parking structure with an expression he was learning to read. Not blankness, but the interior stillness of someone processing multiple variables simultaneously and choosing not to display the process. Ivy had fallen asleep at some point in the last hour, her head against the door, her bag still in her lap. She was still asleep now. Dominic looked at her in the mirror. He had a daughter who fell asleep in vehicles fleeing hostile situations, who slept with her bag in her lap, who had mapped the exits of a building she'd lived in for 2 years without being asked and without telling anyone, on the working assumption that she might need them. He looked at her and felt the anger from the farmhouse kitchen again, the cold, architectural kind, the kind that didn't burn out but accumulated instead, growing denser and more specific with every hour. He was going to find Lucien. He was going to look him in the face. And then everything that had been done, to Mara, to Ivy, to the 12 years that were simply gone and could not be recovered, was going to have a reckoning. He didn't think about what form that reckoning took. He thought about the fact of it and let that be enough for now. At 6:55, he told Torres to stay with the vehicle and told Mara and Ivy to stay in the parking structure while he went in first to check the room. Mara looked at him with the expression of someone who had opinions about being told to stay somewhere but was choosing to agree because the logic was sound. Ivy woke up when the door opened and looked around with immediate, clear-eyed alertness that startled him again. He walked the 6 blocks alone in the early gray light, hands in pockets, moving at the pace of a man who had somewhere to be and wasn't in a hurry about it. The city at this hour was people going to work, delivery trucks, the first cafes opening. Nobody looked at him twice. Nobody ever did when he moved right. The coffee shop was a corner space with large windows, which was not ideal from a security standpoint, but which Sina had chosen both times before because she said she thought better with natural light, and he had not argued. He could see through the window before he reached the door. She was there, alone, sitting at the back table, not the corner, the second from back, which gave her a clear sight line to the door and the windows simultaneously. She had a coffee in front of her that she wasn't drinking, and she was looking at her phone, and when he pushed the door open, she looked up and her face did nothing dramatic, just registered him and registered the circumstances and put the phone face down. He ordered coffee at the counter and carried it to her table and sat down. "You look like you've been awake all night," she said. "I have. The Bryn code means I shouldn't ask how you found me or how I should have found you." "That's correct." She picked up her coffee, put it down. "How bad?" "Bad." He kept his voice below the ambient noise of the room. "I need you to listen without reacting. There's a lot and we don't have a lot of time." She nodded once. He told her. Not everything. Not Mara, not Ivy, not the cafe or the mountain, or the personal dimensions of any of it. What she needed to know was operational, that the internal communication system had been accessed by someone using Rourke's credentials to send a hostile message, that 3 tactical teams had engaged his location overnight, that he had reason to believe Lucien Vescari was alive and had been running a shadow operation against the family bloodline for over a decade. When he stopped talking, Senna was quiet for approximately 10 seconds. "Rourke," she said. 1 word. "Yes." 11 years. "Yes." She looked past him at the window. The morning light was coming in stronger now. "He has access to the Foundation accounts," she said. "The restructured portfolio. Every legitimate asset the organization built over the last decade." Dominic looked at her. "I flagged an anomaly 8 months ago," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not fear more like the specific frustration of someone who was right when being right was the worst possible outcome. Transfers. Small ones, distributed across 12 accounts, irregular intervals. I flagged it, and Rourke told me it was a restructuring he was managing on your behalf. I asked you about it. He searched his memory. You sent a report. A written summary. You told me Rourke had briefed you and it was handled. He had never spoken to Rourke about it. He was certain of that now, which meant someone had responded to Senna's inquiry on his behalf, using his name, with enough accurate contextual detail that she had accepted it. How much? He said. Over 8 months? Approximately 9 million, distributed in pieces small enough to not trigger automatic review. But Dominic... She stopped. That's not the part that worries me. 9 million is a rounding error. What worries me is where it went. Tell me. I traced it last week. I hadn't planned to. I thought it was handled. But I had an instinct. She paused. It went into a holding structure, a legal entity I'd never seen before, incorporated 7 years ago in a jurisdiction that doesn't require beneficial owner disclosure. I ran the corporate genealogy as far as I could and hit a wall. But the shell that controls the holding structure, the name on the original incorporation document, whose name? A man named Aldrich Penn. The coffee shop noise continued around them. Someone at the counter laughed at something. A truck went past outside. The ceiling fan moved the air slowly above their heads. Dominic looked at the table surface and then looked at Senna and worked very hard to keep his face from doing what it wanted to do. Penn, who Mara had been told to go to, who had been given to her as a lifeline, an emergency contact, a safe destination if everything else failed. Who was dead now, Cale had said. Dead for days, which meant someone had cleaned the exit point before the exit point was needed. Cleaned it and left the 9 million sitting in Penn's corporate structure, sitting there like a paper trail with legs, sitting there in a way that would be found when someone looked. When someone looked. He thought about Lucien's photograph, the deliberate eye contact, the handwritten note. Come home and we can finish this the right way. Not the communication of a man operating from concealment. The communication of a man who had decided concealment was no longer the strategy, who had moved from managing a problem to ending it, who had spent 12 years arranging pieces on a board and had decided the board was now positioned the way he wanted it. Senna was watching his face. What else? He said. The Viscari Foundation Gala, she said. It's in 4 days. The annual event, the ballroom at the Hartwell. You've committed to attend. 300 guests, foundation donors, the public-facing half of everything the organization is supposed to represent. He knew the gala. He had agreed to chair it 3 months ago as part of a broader effort to shift the organization's public profile. It was on its face the most exposed and accessible he would be for any single evening of the year. Someone will make a move at the gala, he said. If I were planning something against you, Senna said carefully, and I had spent 12 years preparing it, and I had assets inside your security infrastructure, and I wanted to end it publicly and completely, the gala would be the move. Why publicly? Because the foundation is the legitimate face of the organization, because destroying it there in front of 300 witnesses, in front of the cameras and the donors and the public record, it doesn't just remove you, it collapses the legitimate structure at the same time, makes everything that comes after look like the cleanup of a criminal enterprise rather than a hostile takeover. She held his gaze. Whoever inherits what's left inherits it clean. No challenge to the transition, no question of legitimacy. The story writes itself. Dominic sat with that for a moment. He thought about it the way he thought about chess. Not the next move, but the position the current move was building toward. Lucien didn't want to kill him in a farmhouse in the dark. Lucien didn't want to run him off a mountain road. Those options had existed for 12 years and hadn't been taken. What Lucien wanted was the specific optics of a public collapse, a criminal patriarch exposed, his empire dismantled by its own contradictions, the legitimate structure falling with it. And then, from the wreckage, Lucien emerging as the man who had predicted this, who had understood the bloodline wasn't fit to lead, who had spent years in obscurity assembling the alternative. Not murder, succession. He had been working toward a succession. I need 2 things from you, Dominic said. First, every financial record connected to Penn, to the holding structure, to Rourke's transfers. Everything you found and everything you can still access. I need it documented and secured outside our network. Done, Sina said. I started a parallel record the day I traced Penn. It's in a private archive that has no connection to any Viscari infrastructure. Of course she had. He looked at her. Second, the gala. Don't cancel it. She looked at him. Don't change anything. Don't alert security. Don't alter the guest list. It happens as planned. Dominic, it happens as planned, he said again. Because if it's where Lucian intends to make his move, it's also where I intend to be when he does. She was quiet for a moment. You're going to let him come to you. I'm going to let him come to me in a room I know, at a time I choose. On ground, I'll have 4 days to prepare. He picked up his coffee. Lucien has spent 12 years being patient. He's done being patient. That means he'll move fast and he won't have the temperament to doubt his own plan. And if something goes wrong at the gala, things will go wrong, he said. Something always goes wrong. The question is whether we're positioned to manage it or whether it manages us. He stood, put cash on the table. The records. Today. Get them to a secure location and send me the access through the channel we're using now. And Rourke? She said. Leave Rourke exactly where he is. Let him believe everything is normal. I need him in that building in 4 days. He walked out of the coffee shop into the morning light. He walked 2 blocks before he called Mara. She picked up immediately. We have 4 days, he said, and I need you to come with me, both of you. A pause. To where? The estate. My home. He kept walking. I know that's what the message last night wanted. I know it looks like walking into something. But Mara, if I'm going to take Lucien apart, I need to do it from a position of structural authority. I need to be where I'm supposed to be. I need to look like a man who doesn't know what's coming. While knowing what's coming, she said. Yes. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear very faintly Ivy saying something in the background. She wants to know if there's a school nearby, Mara said. He stopped walking. She says if we're going to be there 4 days, she wants to know if there's something to do besides wait. Mara's voice had something in it that might, under different circumstances, have been amusement. She says waiting makes her anxious. He stood on the sidewalk in the early morning city light and thought about his daughter asking about schools in the middle of the most dangerous 4 days of his life, and felt something in the vicinity of his sternum that he didn't have a precise name for. There's a library, he said, in the estate. It's large. She says that'll work. He kept walking. The estate was 3 hours south. A compound, technically. The main house and 3 outbuildings on 40 acres of enclosed property that had belonged to the Viscari family for 2 generations. Walls, cameras, a full security team, the public face of old money and private discretion. Dominic had lived there for 15 years and had never made the mistake of thinking it was home rather than a fortress. They arrived at midday. Torres drove them through the main gate and up the gravel drive to the front entrance, and the house opened around them. High ceilings, stone floors, the particular smell of a large maintained building that had history in its walls. The security chief, a man named Barris, met them in the entrance hall. Barris was not a Lucian placement. Dominic was as certain of this as he was certain of anything, which he now understood meant approximately 90%. But 90 was what he had to work with. Barris had come to him through a law enforcement contact 8 years ago, vetted independently, with a professional background that predated any Viscari association. He had seen nothing in 8 years to make him doubt that. He pulled Barris aside while Torres took Mara and Ivy upstairs. 4 days, he said. The gala. I need the security plan reviewed from the beginning. Not adjusted, reviewed. Completely new eyes on every element. Personnel rotations, sight lines, access points, communications protocols. Everything. Barris looked at him with the expression of a professional who understood that a complete review from scratch implied a reason for it. How compromised are we talking? Assume at least one person on the current security detail is not who they said they are. Possibly more. I need that identified without alerting whoever it is. Barris absorbed that without visible reaction. And Rourke? Rourke is not involved in gala security. He never has been. Don't change that. All right. Barris paused. And the guests in the East Wing? Their family, Dominic said, and heard himself say it and let it stand. Barris went to work. The next 3 days were a particular kind of controlled tension. Everything on the surface moving in its normal groove, the estate operating as it always operated, staff going about their routines, gala preparations advancing through the usual channels, Rourke visible in his usual capacity, doing his usual things in a way that Dominic now watched with the specific attention of a man who had been looking at a painting for years and has just been told the canvas is hollow. He watched Rourke. He watched the way Rourke moved through the estate, who he spoke to, the slight additional length of certain phone calls, the moments when he stepped away from common areas to make contact with someone he didn't name. He watched and he cataloged, and he said nothing. Sina had delivered the financial documentation on the first day. It sat in a secure archive that existed entirely outside the organizational infrastructure, accessible through a channel that no one in the estate's communication network knew about. Evidence. Not complete, not courtroom ready, not yet, but enough to form the spine of something, enough to be the thing you held up when the room needed the truth to be visible. Mara spent the 3 days in a way he hadn't expected. She explored the estate with the systematic attention of someone mapping a space they might need to navigate under pressure. She spoke with the household staff with a directness that was apparently disarming. Within 24 hours, she knew names, schedules, which doors stuck, which cameras had the shortest rotation gap. She did all of this quietly and without being asked, and when Dominic noticed it and said nothing, she said, "I've been the only adult in every room for 12 years. Some habits don't need instruction." Ivy found the library on the first afternoon. It was large, 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves, a rolling ladder, a long table, and 4 reading chairs, north-facing windows that kept the light good and even all day. She sat up at the table with her bag and a notebook and worked her way through the shelves with the methodical appetite of someone who had been told for 12 years that books were the most portable form of anywhere else you could be. On the second evening, Dominic found her there after dinner, a book open and a separate notebook filled with her own writing, small and exact, the same handwriting he had noticed on the order pad in the café. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. "What are you writing?" he said. She didn't startle. She looked up with the unhurried gaze he was becoming familiar with. "Questions," she said. "About what?" "About how this works, the organization, the legal structure, the foundation." She paused. "How it's supposed to work and how it actually works." He came into the room and sat in one of the reading chairs. "Why?" "Because in 4 days something is going to happen at that gala, and I want to understand the structure of what's at stake." She held the notebook. "I've been reading the Foundation's public reports. They're in the library, from the last 6 years, and there are things that don't connect." He looked at her. "The investment yield on the Eastern portfolio doesn't match the publicly reported returns," she said. "The gap is small enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking specifically at the quarterly granularity. But it's consistent over 3 years. Someone has been skimming from the returns before they hit the reported numbers." She handed him the notebook. He looked at the figures she had written, the comparison, the gap, the consistency. He looked at his 12-year-old daughter. "Where did you learn to read financial reports?" he said. "Mom made me learn when I was 9, she said. She said the most dangerous thing a woman can be is financially illiterate." A beat. "She also said the second most dangerous thing is being surprised." He looked at the notebook for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "The numbers you found, this is evidence of a secondary extraction, different from what Sanaa found but connected to the same network." "I know," Ivy said. "That's why I wrote it down." He sat in the library with his daughter and the financial records of an organization he had run for 20 years and began to understand the specific shape of what Lucian had built. Not a blunt assault on the Viscari Empire, but a slow, precise excavation of it, conducted from inside its own foundations year by year, moving money and information and loyalty into position with the patience of someone who knew exactly how long they had and had never been in a hurry. He thought about the gala. Ballroom, 300 guests, cameras, the legitimate face of everything. He thought about Rourke somewhere in the estate, filing reports to an audience Dominic couldn't see. He thought about a photograph of an old man sitting at a desk, looking directly at the camera, having decided the time for patience was finished. The fourth day arrived. The Hartwell was the kind of hotel that had been built in an era when buildings were meant to announce something. Grand entrance, high ceilings, ballroom on the second floor with floor-to-ceiling windows that opened onto a rooftop terrace overlooking the city's central district. The foundation had used it for the gala 3 years running. The venue knew them. The catering staff knew them. The room setup was familiar, the flow established, the logistics reduced to the comfortable routine of repetition, which was, Dominic understood now, exactly the problem. He arrived at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours before the event opened, with Barris and 2 members of the reviewed security team. He walked every inch of the room. The ballroom, the terrace, the service corridors behind the kitchen access, the stairwells at both ends of the floor, the elevator banks, the utility rooms. He did it himself, personally, because there was no one else he trusted to have the same specific knowledge of what he was looking for. He found 3 things that shouldn't have been there. The first was a small device attached to the underside of the main communications panel in the security office adjacent to the ballroom, a signal interceptor capable of disrupting the encrypted frequency the security team used for their earpieces without blocking the frequency entirely, causing selective outages rather than complete failure. The kind of device that was placed by someone who knew the security frequency, which meant someone with internal access. The second was a key card in the catering manager's office that had not been issued by the hotel. A duplicate, created for a room whose lock had been recently changed to match the duplicate's code. The room was a utility space 2 doors from the ballroom that could function as a staging area. The third was a name on the supplemental catering staff roster that matched a name in the Viscari personnel files from 9 years ago. A man who had left the organization had been allowed to leave quietly, without incident, and had not been seen since. Dominic looked at the 3 things and thought about the photograph. Come home and we can finish this the right way. He understood now what the right way was. Not gunfire in a farmhouse, not a car on a mountain road. A public event. A crisis engineered in a room full of witnesses. Security communication disrupted, a staging area prepped. A planted asset in the catering staff. And somewhere, on the rooftop probably, with a sightline to the terrace, something or someone that constituted the final piece. He called Mara. She and Ivy were in a suite on the 9th floor of the hotel. He had moved them there at noon, which Mara had accepted without objection, which told him she understood the geometry of what tonight was. It's set up, he said when she picked up. How bad? Sophisticated. Planned well in advance. They know the room. Do you know how many people? Not yet, but I know the move. Or most of it. A pause. And the part you don't know? Whether Lucien is in the building himself or whether he's running it from somewhere else. Does it matter? Tonight? Yes. He was looking at the ballroom through the security office window, the tables being set, the staff moving between them, the chandeliers lit above a room that in 3 hours would be full of people who had no idea what the evening was going to be. If he's here, there's a chance to end it completely. If he's not, I take apart what he's built tonight and deal with him separately. Be careful which one you're hoping for, Mara said. Why? Because wanting to end it completely is how you make mistakes. You know that better than I do. He stood at the window and thought about whether she was right. He decided she was right. He decided to file it and move past it because there was no version of tonight where careful was going to be sufficient, and the best he could do was careful and fast and hope the combination held. The guests began arriving at 7. The ballroom filled with the specific noise and warmth of 300 people who believed themselves to be attending a charitable gala and had dressed accordingly. Champagne. String quartet in the corner. The foundation's work displayed on screens around the room. Schools built. Community programs funded. The public architecture of legitimate enterprise. Dominic moved through it with the ease of a man who had done this many times, speaking to the right people for the right lengths of time. Smiling when smiling was called for, projecting the specific steadiness that had always been his most useful public quality. Rourke was in the room. He had arrived with the organizational staff. He was working the room on the opposite side, glad-handing donors, performing normalcy with the fluency that Dominic now read differently than he had an hour ago. Barris was in his earpiece, quiet and constant. At 8:15, the catering staff began clearing the first course. Dominic watched the man with the planted name move between tables and tracked his position every 30 seconds without appearing to track anything. At 8:40, the string quartet paused for remarks. The foundation director, a genuine woman with no knowledge of anything happening under the surface of her organization, speaking about programs and impact and the generosity of the assembled donors. Dominic stood to the right of the podium and listened and watched the room and watched the service corridor door and watched Rourke across the ballroom shift his position by 10 feet, moving closer to the eastern stairwell. 8:47. The remarks ended. Applause. The quartet resumed. Dominic's earpiece clicked twice. Barris's signal. Something at the terrace access. He was already moving when the lights went out. Not a power failure. Surgical. The kind produced by a device that cuts a specific circuit while leaving the emergency lighting intact. The ballroom dropped to half illumination. The chandeliers dead. The screen displays dark. The room going from warm and bright to shadowed and dim in a single second. 300 people stopped talking simultaneously and then started again at higher volume. In the confusion, two things happened. The service corridor door opened and 3 men came through fast. Not catering staff. The uniforms were close but wrong. The movement patterns entirely different from people carrying plates. They moved with the spread and the angular efficiency of trained personnel entering a space with a purpose. And Rourke, on the far side of the room, produced a phone and made a call. Dominic saw both things. He processed both things. He made a choice. He went for Rourke. He crossed the ballroom in the half-dark with the noise of alarmed guests around him and reached Rourke from the side before Rourke had finished dialing. He got the phone out of Rourke's hand in a movement that looked, to anyone watching, like nothing more than 2 men in close proximity. He put himself between Rourke and the eastern stairwell and looked at Rourke's face from approximately 18 inches. Rourke was 54 years old. He had a broad, steady face that Dominic had looked at across conference tables for 11 years. That face was doing something now that it had never done in any of those meetings. It was afraid. Not the polished performance of a man managing a tense situation. Genuine, physical, arriving from somewhere deep, afraid. "He's in the building," Rourke said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I was calling to tell you, he's in the building. He arrived an hour ago. Staff entrance on the north side, came in with the second catering crew. Dominic, I was calling to... Tell me you weren't calling to warn him." "I swear," Rourke's jaw was tight. "I swear on everything. I'm done. I've been done for 2 years. I didn't know how to get out without..." He stopped. "He has people who watch me. He has had people watching me since day one. I couldn't move without him knowing. I've been trying to find a way out for 2 years. Dominic looked at him. He did the thing he had done for 30 years. Read the surface of a face for the truth underneath it. He was aware that Lucien had managed his access to information for 30 years, and he was aware that awareness itself was not immunity. He was also aware that 11 years of watching a man's face across tables gave you something that intelligence reports didn't. "Where is he in the building?" Dominic said. "Rooftop," Rourke said. "The terrace above the ballroom. That's always been the final position. He comes to the terrace, you come out to the terrace, and..." He stopped. "The men who just came through the service door. They're not here for the guests. They're here to push you out to the terrace." The 3 men in the service uniforms had not drawn weapons. They were moving through the crowd, creating disruption, pressuring the room's geometry, herding without appearing to herd, the specific technique of a team that wanted movement rather than confrontation. Barris's voice in his earpiece was tight. 3 hostiles in the room, non-lethal posture, moving guests toward the terrace access. 2 more at the north stairwell. "We have a guest with a medical situation in the east corridor. Possible distraction. Hold all positions," Dominic said into the earpiece. "Do not engage the room. Get civilians toward the west exit, quiet as possible. No panic. I need the terrace access held open." "Dominic," Barris started. "Do it." He looked at Rourke. "Stay in this room. Stay visible. Don't move until I come back." He moved toward the terrace. The doors to the rooftop terrace were open, had been opened from the outside, the security hold released by whatever device had cut the lighting circuit. Night air came through, city noise, the distant grid of lights spreading in every direction below. The terrace was wide, a broad stone platform above the city, with the ballroom glass behind it and the urban skyline in front of it, and the particular quality of height that stripped everything down to essential components. Lucian Viscari was standing at the terrace railing. He was older than the photograph had suggested and younger looking than 12 years of supposed death should have allowed. He was wearing a dark suit that had been fitted well once and still held its shape. His white hair was neat. His posture was the posture of someone who had been waiting a comfortable amount of time and was content to wait a little longer. He turned when Dominic came through the terrace doors. He smiled. It was the same smile Dominic had seen across dinner tables for 30 years. The patient, informed smile of a man who believed he understood the situation better than whoever he was talking to. The smile of a mentor. The smile of someone who was always several steps ahead and wanted you to know it. Dominic, he said. His voice was older. The texture of it had changed, but the cadence was exactly what Mara had described. The rhythm she had recognized through a phone speaker in a back room 6 months ago. The rhythm of a man who gave instructions and didn't repeat them. Lucien, Dominic said. He stopped 10 feet from him. He didn't draw his weapon. He looked at the old man at the railing and thought about 30 years and felt the full weight of it sitting on him and let it sit. You found her by accident, Lucian said. That's genuinely true. I want you to know I know that. The rock slide, the rerouting, pure chance. He seemed to find this interesting rather than troubling. I've been planning for contingencies for a long time, and that one never appeared in any model I ran. But you adapted, Dominic said. I always adapt. He turned slightly, looking out at the city. Do you know how long I've loved this family? Genuinely. Your father and I built something real, something that was supposed to outlast us both. He paused, and then he died, and you took it apart. Not quickly. Slowly. Decision by decision. Relationship by relationship. You were always too sentimental for this work, too willing to let emotion cloud the ledger. You mean Mara. I mean everything she represents. Vulnerability, attachment. The specific weakness of a man who lets himself love something the wrong people can use against him. He turned back. I didn't create that weakness. I just managed it. For the good of the family. You tried to have her killed, Dominic said. She was pregnant. She was a liability, Lucian said, as was what she was carrying, as is the girl now, you understand that. You know the mathematics of it even if you don't want to do the arithmetic. He spread his hands, a gesture of reasonableness, of patience, of a teacher explaining something for the final time. But you found them before I could manage the situation. So now we're here, and you have a choice. Tell me the choice, Dominic said. Walk away from them, Lucian said. Tonight. Walk away. Let them go. Let me manage the situation the way I should have managed it 12 years ago, and the organization survives intact. Your name stays on the foundation. Your legacy stays clean. Everything continues. He paused. Or you don't walk away, and everything you've built comes down with you. Dominic stood on the terrace above the city and looked at the man who had shaped him and betrayed him and managed him for the entirety of his adult life, and felt the cold architectural anger in him reach a specific density that he recognized as the moment before a decision becomes irreversible. He thought about Ivy's notebook, the financial gaps she had found in 3 days, the questions she had written in small, exact handwriting because she wanted to understand the structure of what was at stake. He thought about Mara's voice on the phone. Be careful which one you're hoping for. He thought about a girl who had mapped the exits of every room she had ever lived in and still, somehow, found time to ask if there was a library. He looked at Lucy Yen. There's a third option, he said. And behind him, the terrace doors opened, and Senna Voss walked through them carrying a tablet with a live feed to a secure server. And Barris walked through them with 2 men, and from inside the ballroom came the sound of the lights coming back on as the backup system engaged. And Dominic watched Lucien's patient smile do something it had never done in 30 years of tables and rooms and long-managed situations. The smile faltered. That was all. Just a fraction of a second. The specific, almost imperceptible hesitation of a man who had engineered every room he had ever stood in and was now standing in one he hadn't engineered. Lucien Vescari, who had spent 12 years operating from the certainty of his own invisible hand, looked at Senna Voss walking through the terrace doors with a tablet in her hands, and something in the machinery of his composure skipped a beat. It came back immediately. The smile resettled. But Dominic had seen it, and knowing what he was looking for made it possible to see it again. The micro-adjustments, the recalibrations happening behind Lucy N's eyes as he assessed the new geometry of the terrace and found it different from the geometry he had planned for. Senna stopped 4 feet to Dominic's right. She turned the tablet's screen outward. It displayed a live connection. Not to the secure server she had mentioned, but to something else. A split screen. On one side, the documentation she had assembled, Penn's corporate structure, Rourke's transfers, the financial genealogy traced through 12 shell entities back to a single account that bore Lucien Vescari's original identification number from before his supposed death. On the other side, a video feed. Live. A room somewhere that was not the Hartwell Hotel. 3 men in that room, seated at a table, facing a camera. Men Dominic didn't recognize. Lucien looked at the tablet. He looked at the men in the video feed. The men in the video feed were looking at the camera with the expression of people who have recently been given a reason to cooperate and have decided cooperation is the correct response. His senior attachés, Senna said, without looking at Lucien. She was speaking to Dominic, but the words were for the terrace. The 3 men who have been running his operational network for the last 7 years. They were located 6 hours ago. They're currently speaking with law enforcement at 3 separate locations. She paused. They've been speaking for approximately 2 hours. Lucien looked at the tablet for another moment. Then he looked at Dominic. The patient smile was gone. What replaced it was something that Dominic found harder to look at. Not anger, not fear, but the specific expression of a man who has invested everything in a single architecture and is watching it come apart and cannot quite believe the material was that fragile. "You had this ready," Lucien said. "Senna has been building it for 8 months, Dominic said, since she found the first anomaly in the Eastern portfolio. She didn't know what she was building toward, but she's thorough." 8 months, Lucien said. He seemed to turn that over. Before the girl. Before the girl. A pause. The city spread below them, indifferent and enormous, lights in every direction to every horizon. Wind came off the rooftop and moved through Lucien's white hair, and he didn't do anything about it. "Then it wasn't her that exposed me," Lucien said. It wasn't quite a question. "She accelerated it," Dominic said. "She found the secondary extraction in 3 days with 6 years of public foundation reports." He held the old man's gaze. "My daughter is smarter than you planned for." Something moved in Lucien's expression at the word daughter, something that was not, Dominic thought, entirely uncomplicated. The old man looked away. Out at the city, briefly. The way people look away when they need a moment that doesn't have a witness. "She's a Vescari," Lucien said quietly. "Yes." "That's the problem," he said. "That was always the problem. The bloodline doesn't dilute, it concentrates. And a concentrated bloodline with an outside attachment, with someone who lives beyond the structure, beyond the control." "Stop," Dominic said. Lucien stopped. "I don't want the argument," Dominic said. "I've had it in my head for 4 days, both sides of it, every version of how you'd frame what you did and why. I don't need to hear it out loud." He kept his voice level. "Not cold. Something past cold. Something that had moved through cold and come out the other side into a place that was just very, very clear. Here's what happens now. Barris." Barris moved forward. Lucien looked at the 2 men who came with Barris, and at the tablet in Senna's hands, and at the live feed of his 3 senior people in 3 separate rooms, and he made the assessment that a precise man makes when the mathematics no longer support any available option. He put his hands forward. He didn't say anything. He looked at Dominic once more, briefly, with an expression that Dominic spent a long time afterward trying to categorize. It wasn't regret. It was something older and more specific than regret. The look of a man who has spent his life certain he understood something fundamental about power and loyalty and the maintenance of order, and has arrived at the end of that certainty and found himself unable to identify where the error was. Barris put cuffs on him. Lucien let it happen without resistance. They took him through the terrace doors and into the service corridor and out of the ballroom and out of the building. The law enforcement presence that Sina had arranged, not the city police, a federal task force that had been building a separate case on Vescari organizational activity for 3 years and had been quietly provided with everything Sina had assembled over the last 4 days, was waiting at the north service entrance in 3 unmarked vehicles. Dominic stood at the terrace railing and watched them go. He stood there for a while. The city did not notice. 300 guests inside the ballroom were being managed by staff and the foundation director and the returning lights, and a story about an electrical issue that was plausible enough to explain most of what had happened. The 3 men who had come through the service door were contained in the basement level, where 2 of Barris's reviewed people had taken them with a minimum of noise and a maximum of efficiency. Rourke was still in the ballroom, still visible, doing what Dominic had told him to do. His face the face of a man who had been holding something for a very long time and had just put it down and didn't know yet what his hands were supposed to do without the weight. Senna came back to the terrace. She stood beside him at the railing and didn't say anything for a while. "The federal case," Dominic said, "it absorbs everything we provided. It becomes the primary record." She looked at the city, which means the Foundation's involvement is part of that record. "I know. The legitimate infrastructure, the portfolio, the programs, the public work, it's all going to need to be restructured, independently audited, probably placed under independent management during the review period." She paused. "It survives, if you want it to, but it won't be yours, not for a while." "I know," he said again. She looked at him, and the other part. He understood what she meant. The other part, the operational side, the structure that had existed for 60 years before the Foundation was built alongside it. The side that didn't appear in the public reports, but that had always been the engine under everything. His father's engine. The engine Lucien had helped build and had then tried to repossess. "It's done," he said. Senna was quiet. "Not managed," he said, not restructured. "Done. I'm going to spend the next several years cooperating with every process that wants a piece of it because that's the only way to be clean on the other side." He kept his hands on the railing. "There won't be another side that looks like what this looked like. That's the deal." "That's a significant thing to give up," she said. "Yes. You built most of it." "I built most of it on information someone else was filtering for me." He looked at his hands. "I don't know which parts are actually mine. I don't know what I would have built without Lucien's hand in it. I'm not willing to spend the rest of my life operating something I can't trust the foundation of." Senna considered this. She was not a sentimental woman, and she did not offer comfort, and he didn't want any. "All right," she said. "Then I'll start the documentation process tonight." She went back inside. He stood at the railing a while longer. The city did its city things below him. Someone somewhere was happy. Someone was asleep. Someone was having the worst night of their life and didn't know yet that they'd survive it. He pushed himself off the railing and went inside to find his family. Mara was in the 9th floor suite when he knocked. She opened the door herself. Torres was in the corridor, his face saying that the night had resolved in a direction that was livable. Inside, Ivy was at the window seat with the notebook on her knee, looking at the city from the hotel's height, the same city he had been looking at from the terrace 20 floors above. She turned when he came in. She looked at his face with the direct, reading attention that he had come to understand was her primary mode. Not performance, not the performed casualness of a child trying to seem unaffected. Genuine assessment, taking the available information and processing it. "It's over," she said. "The immediate part," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means what was going to happen tonight has happened, and the people responsible for the last 12 years are in custody, and from here it's a legal process rather than a physical threat." Ivy turned this over. "That's not the same as over." "No, it's not. There's a lot ahead that's going to be slow and difficult and expensive, and some of it will be public." He sat on the edge of the chair across from her window seat. "I'm not going to tell you it's clean. It isn't." She looked at him. "But we're safe." "Yes. As much as I can guarantee that, yes." She looked back at the city for a moment. Then, was it him? The one from the photograph? Yes. What happens to him? He'll be prosecuted. He's an old man with significant resources who will use those resources to prolong the process as long as possible. But the evidence is complete and the documentation is solid, and the people closest to him are cooperating. He paused. He'll spend what's left of his life in a room he didn't choose. Ivy was quiet. She looked at the notebook in her hands. He thought the bloodline was the important thing, she said. It wasn't a question. She was working something out. Yes, but he was willing to destroy it to protect it. He thought he was the bloodline, Dominic said. He thought his understanding of what it meant was the thing that needed preserving, not the people, the idea. He looked at her. That's how you end up doing what he did. You fall in love with an idea and you start treating the people attached to it as subordinate to the idea. Ivy absorbed this. She wrote something in the notebook, small and quick. He didn't ask what. Mara was at the room's desk. She had been sitting there when he came in, a glass of water in front of her that she hadn't been drinking. She was looking at him now, had been looking at him since he came in, actually, with the specific attention of someone who has been waiting for information and is now receiving it and processing the full weight of what it means. Done? She said. One word. The same word she had been saying and asking for 12 years in various forms. Is it done? Will it ever be done? Can we stop running now? Done, he said. She looked at her hands on the desk. She breathed in once, long and slow, and let it out. She didn't cry. He hadn't expected her to. She was not a woman who saved things up for later in a way that came out as crying. What she did was sit very still for about 30 seconds with her hands flat on the desk and the breath going in and out, and her face doing the private work of a person who has been carrying something for so long that putting it down changes their center of gravity, and they have to find the new balance before they can move. Then she said, I want to go home. He looked at her. The cafe. Yes. Mara, I know what it is, she said. I know it's a building, and it's been a night, and it's 200 kilometers, and we're all exhausted. I know that. She looked at him directly. I want to go home. He understood. The cafe was the only place in 12 years that had been home long enough to feel like one. The longest 2 years in a sequence of places that had only ever been temporary. Going back to it wasn't sentiment. It was the specific need of a person who has been through something enormous to be in a place that knows them, where the floor plan is familiar and the smell is right and the weight of the space doesn't require constant interpretation. Tomorrow, he said, we sleep first. Tomorrow, we go. She held his gaze for a moment, checking the truth of it. Then she nodded. They slept. It was not the sleep of people who had resolved everything and were at peace. It was the sleep of 3 people who had been running on adrenaline and decision-making for 4 days and had finally crossed a threshold where the body simply refused further negotiation. Dominic took the chair in the sitting room and slept harder than he had slept in years. Without dreams, without the half-alert monitoring that had become so habitual, he had stopped recognizing it as something unusual. He woke at 6 to gray light through the curtains and the distant sounds of the city starting its morning. He sat for a while in the chair without moving. He thought about the previous 12 years. He thought about the next 12. He didn't have a clear picture of the next 12, and he was, for the first time in a long time, willing to let that be true without immediately trying to build a structure around it. They left the hotel at 9. Torres drove. Kail, who had returned overnight from the Bryn contact situation and had been briefed on everything, rode in front. Mara sat behind Torres and watched the city give way to suburbs, and then to the road that opened up toward the mountains. Ivy sat between them and had her notebook and wrote in it for the first hour without talking, then closed it and put her head back and watched the sky through the window. Nobody talked much. The silence was not the silence of unresolved things. It was the silence of people who had said most of what needed to be said and understood that the rest would take longer and didn't need to happen in a moving car. At the 2-hour mark, Ivy said, "The library at the estate. The access." Dominic looked at her in the mirror. "What about it? Is it still available? The archive, the Foundation reports." He thought about what he had told Sina the previous night, the restructuring. the independent management, the dismantling of everything that had operated in the gray. For a while, he said, there'll be a transition period before the estate's assets are formally reviewed. I want to go back, she said. Before the review period, I want to finish the cross-referencing. Mara turned and looked at her daughter. You want to finish the audit? I want to make sure the record is complete, Ivy said. Whatever documentation Senna has, the financial evidence, there are gaps in the secondary extraction layer that I found. If those gaps aren't closed, someone in the legal process will find them and not know what they mean and either dismiss them or misinterpret them. She looked at her notebook. I know what they mean. The car was quiet for a moment. You want to contribute to the legal process, Dominic said. I want the record to be complete, she said again. That's all. He looked at her in the mirror. The silver blue eyes looking back at him were clear and practical, and not, he thought, asking for permission exactly. More checking whether it was logistically viable. She had the particular self-possession of someone who had already decided and was presenting the decision rather than requesting a verdict. I'll arrange access, he said. She went back to the notebook. Mara was looking out the window at the mountain road beginning. The incline was starting, the pines thickening on both sides, the particular quality of mountain light falling different from the valley light they'd spent the last days in. She had one hand against the glass and was watching the landscape pass with an expression he couldn't fully read from the angle he had. What are you thinking? He said. She kept looking out the window. I'm thinking the soup I made yesterday morning is probably still in the kitchen, and that I need new glasses for the front windows because one of your men broke 2 when they came through last week. A pause. And that I'm going to have to explain to the municipality why there's a burned-out lock on my cold storage door. I'll handle the cold storage door, he said. She turned from the window and looked at him. That's not how this works, she said. Not unkind, just direct. I've been handling the cold storage door and everything like it for 12 years. You don't arrive and start handling things. I know. You help. When I ask for help. That's different. I know, he said again. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she looked back out the window. Ask me what I need, she said. Don't assume. He sat with that. It was the most important thing she had said to him in 4 days, and she had said it in the quietest voice, looking at pine trees. What do you need? He said. Right now? I need to get home and open the cafe and serve the Tuesday crowd and act like 2 weeks of normal life are possible. She paused. And at some point, not today, I need to sit with Ivy and have a real conversation about what the next year looks like. For her specifically. School, stability. The things she's never had enough of. I want to be part of that conversation, he said. I know you do. She turned and looked at him with the directness that had always been the thing he remembered most clearly about her. Not her face, not her voice, but the specific quality of her attention, the way she looked at things, including him, as if she was going to understand them, whether they cooperated or not. You can be. But you're going to have to understand that being part of the conversation doesn't mean driving it. Understood. And that 12 years of not being there doesn't get remedied by being there very intensely for a short period. It gets remedied by being there consistently for a long time in a way that's useful and not overwhelming. Understood, he said again. She held his gaze a moment longer, then the corner of her mouth moved. Not a full smile, something smaller and more honest than a smile. The expression of a woman who has decided something and isn't yet sure if she's right, but is willing to find out. She turned back to the window. The cafe appeared around a bend in the mountain road. The same building, the same faded remnants of the sign above the door, the same packed dirt parking area. It looked exactly as it had the morning they had left it, which was somehow startling. Dominic had expected it to look different. Events of that magnitude seemed like they should change the appearance of the places where they happened. They didn't. Torres pulled into the parking area. Mara was out of the car before it fully stopped. Not rushing, moving with purpose, the way a person moves when they're going somewhere that belongs to them. She had her key out and the door open, and she was inside before the men were fully out of the vehicle. Ivy got out more slowly. She stood in the parking area in the mountain morning light and looked at the building and then looked around at the tree line and the road and the mountain above. She was taking inventory, Dominic realized, seeing it differently than she had seen it before. The same building, but she was standing in a different relationship to it now. Not just the place she lived, but the place where everything had shifted. He stood beside her. "You all right?" he said. She thought about it in the way she thought about things. Actually thought, didn't just reach for the nearest acceptable answer. "Yes," she said. "I think so." She paused. "It feels weird to be back." "I know. It feels like it should look different." "I had the same thought." She looked at him sideways. "Did you?" "Just now, when we pulled up." She looked back at the building. "It's strange," she said. "I spent 12 years thinking this is just where we are for now. Every place was just where we are for now, and now it might actually be somewhere we stay." She paused. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it yet," he said. "People keep saying that," she said. "You don't have to decide yet. You don't have to know yet. You have time." She looked at him. "I've never had time before. It's a weird thing to suddenly have." He stood beside his daughter on packed dirt in front of a mountain cafe and thought about that, about having time, about what it meant to a child who had grown up treating stability as something that could be taken away without notice and had organized her entire interior architecture around that assumption. The exits, the notebook, the financial reports read at 13 because her mother had told her not to be illiterate in the language of the world. All of it made out of the same material. The preparation for the certainty that nothing would last. He didn't say anything about any of this because it would take a long time and they were standing in a parking lot. "The library at the estate is yours," he said, "whenever you want access to it. For as long as it's available." Ivy looked at him. "That's not a trade for anything." "No." "Because I'm not interested in trades," she said. "I'm interested in understanding things. The financial work, that's not for you. It's because incomplete records bother me." "I know." "Okay." She looked at the cafe door. "I'm going to help Mom open up." She went inside. He stood in the parking area for another minute. Torres and Kale and the two remaining men were at the vehicles, giving the space the distance that men who have been doing this work long enough understood was appropriate for moments they hadn't been trained for. He appreciated it without saying so. He went inside. The cafe at mid-morning had a particular light. The windows faced east, and the sun at this hour came in at an angle that hit the counter and the floor and the mismatched chairs and turned everything warm and slightly gold-toned. Mara had the coffee machine running already, the low industrial rumble of it familiar in a way he hadn't expected. She was wiping the counter with the automatic efficiency of someone whose hands knew what to do without instruction. Ivy was already at the chalkboard updating the day's offerings. Her handwriting on the chalkboard was the same as in the notebook, small, exact, each letter the same height. He sat down on a stool at the counter. Mara set a cup in front of him without asking. She poured coffee. She moved away to check something in the kitchen. He drank the coffee. It was the same as it had been 3 weeks ago, strong and slightly bitter and exactly what he needed. He sat and drank it, and listened to the sounds of the building establishing its morning rhythm, and tried to understand what it was that had settled in him somewhere between the terrace last night and this stool this morning. He had spent 51 years building things, organizations, systems, structures of influence and power and control. He had built them well, and he had built them with the specific intelligence of a man who understood that the best structures were the ones that could survive the removal of any single person. He had built himself a world in which he was, technically, replaceable, had done this deliberately, as a matter of discipline, because he had seen what happened when leaders built systems that depended on their personal presence and then ceased to be present. All of that was going to be dismantled now, not by force, by choice. The cooperative process he had described to Senna was not going to be quick or painless or without cost. There were going to be years of legal proceedings and public exposure and the specific humiliation of watching things you built get taken apart by people who hadn't built them and didn't fully understand what they were handling. He was prepared for all of that. He was not happy about it, but he was prepared. What he was less prepared for was the other side. What he built next, or didn't build. What the remainder of a life looked like when the structure that had defined it for 30 years was removed. He had no clear image of that. He had the cafe counter and the coffee and his daughter writing on a chalkboard, and the woman he had loved with the recklessness of a young man moving through the kitchen with the brisk economy of someone who had a day to run and wasn't going to let the previous 3 weeks stop her from running it. He thought this might be enough to build from. The morning proceeded. The Tuesday crowd came in the way Mara had predicted they would. A loose succession of regulars and mountain road travelers, and the two old men who apparently came every Tuesday morning and sat at the corner table for 2 hours with coffee and talked about things Dominic couldn't quite hear from the counter. He stayed on his stool and watched the room work and didn't offer to help because he had been told to wait until he was asked, and he was going to do that even if it was uncomfortable. At 10:30, Mara came to the counter during a lull and refilled his cup without being asked. "You're going to have to go back," she said, "at some point, to the estate, to the process, to whatever this becomes legally." "Yes." "How often?" "As often as necessary." "Which will be often at first." He looked at the cup. "I want to be here when I'm not there." She looked at him. "Here in the cafe or here in the general sense?" "Both." She was quiet for a moment. She had her hands around the coffee pot and was looking at the counter surface with the interior expression he had learned to give space to. "There are things between us that aren't resolved," she said. "I know. That aren't going to be resolved quickly." "I know. 12 years is a long time to be angry at someone," she said. "Even if most of the story turned out to be engineered. The anger was still real. The years were still gone." She looked up at him. "I'm not pretending they weren't. I'm not asking you to." "Good." She set the coffee pot down on the warmer. "Because if you come back here, and I'm not telling you not to come back, it's not going to be easy. I don't know how to do this. I've never done this. I raised a child alone for 12 years, and I was good at it because I didn't have to compromise with anyone, and now there's a person who has opinions, and who Ivy is already watching to understand what he is to her." She stopped. "She's watching you very carefully, Dominic." "I know." "She doesn't do it obviously, but she's measuring you. She measures everything." Mara's voice was matter-of-fact about this in the way that 12 years of parenting gave you matter-of-factness about things that might otherwise be alarming. "She's going to keep measuring for a while. And if you disappear, if the legal process or the estate or whatever remains of the organization pulls you back to a place where you're not here consistently, she'll file it as a data point," Dominic said. Mara looked at him. "Yes." "Then I won't give her that data point." She held his gaze. The sound of the cafe around them, coffee machine, voices at the corner table, Ivy somewhere in the back, continued its ordinary rhythm. "We'll see," Mara said. Not unkind, not pessimistic, just honest about the fact that words were the easiest part of any of this, and what came after words was the part that counted. She picked up the coffee pot and moved to the corner table. He sat with the coffee and the morning light and the familiar rumble of the machine and thought about the word she had used, consistently. He turned it over. He had been consistent in his life, ruthlessly consistent. In fact, consistent in his work and his discipline and his management of risk. He had never been consistent in the specific way she was describing, which was the consistency of presence rather than the consistency of performance. Showing up, not when it advanced something, but simply because you said you would. He thought he could learn it. He was not certain, but he thought so. Ivy came out from the kitchen with a tray of clean cups and set them on the shelf behind the counter. She paused and looked at him. "The two old men in the corner," she said. "They come every Tuesday. Your mother mentioned. They've been coming since before we got here. The owner before us apparently always had their table set when they arrived." She set the last cup on the shelf. "I started doing it when I noticed. They've never mentioned it, but they sit down faster on Tuesdays than any other table." He looked at the two old men who were deep in conversation over their cups and looked back at Ivy. She said this the way she said most things, factually, without decoration. But the fact itself was not a small thing. A 13-year-old girl who had never stayed anywhere long enough to know anyone's habits had noticed, within the 2 years she'd been here, what an old man needed before he knew to ask for it, and had started providing it quietly. "You're good at this," he said. She considered him. "At what specifically?" at paying attention, at knowing what people need before they articulate it. She looked at the counter. Mom says that's a survival skill. It's more than that. Maybe. She picked up the tray. It's still useful either way. She went back into the kitchen. He sat with the coffee and the morning for a while longer. At noon, he went outside and called Senna. The legal process had formally begun that morning. The federal task force had issued its first public statement, brief and carefully worded, confirming an ongoing investigation into financial crimes connected to named entities. Lucian's name was not in the statement yet. It would be, eventually. The media would find the edges of it and push until the center became visible, which was how these things always went. Senna walked him through the immediate steps. He listened and asked specific questions and gave specific instructions, and the whole conversation took 40 minutes. And at the end of it, he was tired in the specific way of someone who has started a very large and slow-moving process and understands they are at the beginning of something that will demand sustained attention for a long time. He put the phone away. He stood in the parking area in the mountain noon light and looked at the cafe and thought about what the next year would look like. The legal process. The estate. The long, grinding work of disentangling 60 years of organizational structure. It was not going to be clean or fast or without pain. There were going to be costs he hadn't fully calculated yet. People who would be affected by decisions he made in the coming months, who had not anticipated those decisions and hadn't deserved to be caught in them. He couldn't do anything about the weight of that except carry it honestly and make the decisions as well as he was able. The afternoon came in slowly, the mountain light changing direction, the gold angle of morning giving way to the flatter illumination of midday, and then beginning the long turn toward early evening. The cafe thinned out as the afternoon progressed. The Tuesday regulars gave way to the occasional road traveler. Mara moved through the quieter hours with the practiced efficiency of someone managing a small operation who understood that the quiet hours were when the maintenance happened. The inventory, the prep for tomorrow, the small repairs that accumulated in any functioning space. At 3 o'clock, Dominic took his jacket off and went behind the counter. Mara turned from the shelf she was organizing and looked at him. The back storage unit on the south wall, he said. The door hinge is wrong. I noticed it last week. Do you have tools? She looked at him for a moment, then, cabinet under the sink, left side. He found the tools. He fixed the hinge. He did it carefully and correctly because he was a man who had always believed that the things worth doing were worth doing well, regardless of scale, and a storage door with a bad hinge was a thing worth doing well. When he came back to the counter, Mara looked at the door and looked at him. The lock on the cold storage, she said. That's a bigger job. Tomorrow, he said. If you want. She considered. Yes, she said. Tomorrow. He stayed through the evening. At 6, Ivy set the tables for dinner service with the same quiet precision she set everything. The silverware placed at exact intervals, the salt and pepper centered, the paper menus squared to the table edge. She did it in the time it took Dominic to drink another cup of coffee and watch her and understand that whatever she was becoming, had been built entirely by the specific conditions of a life that hadn't been easy and had required her to be more than she should have had to be at 12 years old. He thought about what he owed her. He had been thinking about it since the cafe counter 3 weeks ago, and the answer kept getting larger and more complex and more impossible to reduce to any single action or statement. You didn't repay 12 years of absence with presence, no matter how consistent. You didn't make up for what she had been through by being there now. What you did was be there now and let the now accumulate until it was its own thing rather than an apology for the past. You showed up, and you kept showing up, and you didn't make it about yourself, and you waited while she measured you, and you gave her something worth measuring. That was the whole of it. He didn't know how long it would take. He suspected longer than he'd be comfortable with. That was all right. The evening service came and went. The last customers left at 8:30. Ivy cleared tables. Mara wiped the counter and ran the coffee machine through its closing cycle. Dominic collected cups without being asked and set them in the bus tray because it was visible and useful and didn't require instructions. At 9, the cafe was closed and clean. Mara turned off the main lights and left the light above the counter on, the way she apparently always did, a low warm spill across the counter surface that was the last thing visible from the door. They stood in the parking area. Torres and Kale and the remaining men were at the vehicles at a distance that had stopped feeling like a security posture and started feeling like simple discretion, which was probably the most honest form it had ever taken anyway. "You should go," Mara said. "Tonight. Not because you have to, but because you need the estate and the process and whatever comes next to see you handling it. Not here." He looked at her. "Come back on the weekend," she said, "if you can, but go handle what needs handling first." "Friday," he said. "Friday is fine." He looked at Ivy. She was standing with her bag and her notebook looking at the mountain above the tree line, the dark shape of it against the slightly less dark sky. "Ivy," he said. She turned. "The library. I'll call ahead and arrange access. You can go when you're ready." She nodded. She looked at him with those eyes. His eyes. In her face. Carrying everything he hadn't been there for and wasn't going to be able to change, and which had become, somehow, in 3 weeks, the most important thing he looked at in any room he was in. "Thank you," she said. Then, with the considered quality of someone choosing to extend something, "For the hinge." "The lock tomorrow is a bigger job," he said. "Yeah." She looked at the cold storage door visible at the side of the building. "Mom says everything worth having is..." He thought about that. He thought Mara was right about a great many things, and had been right about most of them for longer than he'd known it, and the cost of not knowing it was the specific cost of the last 12 years, which was very high and was going to take a very long time to understand the full dimensions of. He got in the vehicle. As they pulled out of the parking area and onto the mountain road, he turned and looked back through the rear window. The cafe sat in the dark, the one light above the counter visible through the front window, the ghost of the old sign above the door just legible in the headlight's edge. Mara was inside, moving through the last of the closing routine. Ivy stood outside for a moment in the parking area with her notebook, looking after the vehicles, and then she looked up at the mountain instead, at the dark and the pines and the sky that had cleared to show the beginning of stars. He watched until the road curved and the building disappeared behind the trees. He turned back around and looked at the road ahead. There was a long way still to go. There would be mornings that felt impossible and processes that dragged and costs that arrived without warning, and the specific loneliness of having chosen transparency after decades of its opposite. There would be the estate and the legal teams and the restructuring and the public record and whatever remained of the people who had given 12 years of their loyalty to a structure that was now coming apart. There would be the particular difficulty of learning to be present in a way he had never been present before, with a daughter who measured everything and a woman who would tell him precisely when he was getting it wrong. He had no clean picture of what the other side of all of that looked like. He had a cafe counter and strong coffee, and a hinge he'd fixed and a lock he'd fix tomorrow, and a child who had thanked him for the hinge and meant it, and Mara's voice telling him Friday is fine with the specific quality of someone who is not yet ready to hope, but is willing to see. He had enough. He looked at the road and kept going.